With Lee in Virginia by G.A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton Miranda, New Zealand. Chapter 15. Fredericksburg. As soon as breakfast was over, Vincent mounted Wildfire, which had been sent back after he had been taken prisoner, and rode into Richmond. There he reported himself at headquarters as having returned after escaping from a Federal prison, and making his way through the lines of the enemy. "I had my shoulder bone smashed in a fight with some Yankees," he said, "and was laid up in hiding for 6 weeks, but have now fairly recovered. My shoulder at times gives me considerable pain, and although I am desirous of returning to duty and rejoining my regiment until the battle at Fredericksburg has taken place, I must request that 3 months' leave be granted to me after that to return home and complete my cure, promising of course to rejoin my regiment at once should hostilities break out before the spring." "We saw the news that you had escaped," the general said, "but feared, as so long a time elapsed without hearing from you, that you had been shot in attempting to cross the lines. Your request for leave is of course granted, and a note will be made of your zeal in thus rejoining on the very day after your return. The vacancy in the regiment has been filled up, but I will appoint you temporarily to General Stuart's staff, and I shall have great pleasure in today filling up your commission as captain. Now, let me hear how you made your escape. By the accounts published in the Northern papers, it seemed that you must have had a Confederate outside the walls." Vincent gave a full account of his escape from prison, and a brief sketch of his subsequent proceedings, saying only that he was in the house of some loyal people in Tennessee when it was attacked by a party of Yankee bushwhackers, that these were beaten off in a fight, but that he himself had a pistol bullet in the shoulder. He then made his way on until compelled by his wound to lay up for 6 weeks in a lonely farmhouse near Mount Pleasant, that afterwards, in the disguise of a young farmer, he had made a long detour across the Tennessee River and reached Georgia. "When do you leave for the front, Captain Wingfield?" "I shall be ready to start tonight, sir." "In that case I will trouble you to come round here this evening. There will be a fast train going through with ammunition for Lee at 10 o'clock, and I shall have a bag of dispatches for him, which I will trouble you to deliver. You will find me here up to the last moment. I will give orders that a horse box be put on the train." After expressing his thanks, Vincent took his leave. As he left the general's quarters, a young man, just alighting from his horse, gave a shout of greeting. "Why, Wingfield, it's good to see you! I thought you were pining again in the Yankee dungeon, or had got knocked on the head crossing the lines. Where have you sprung from, and when did you arrive?" "I only got in yesterday after sundry adventures which I will tell you about presently. When did you arrive from the front?" "I came down a few days ago on a week's leave on urgent family business," the young man laughed, "and I'm going back again this afternoon by the 4 o'clock train." "Stay till 10, Vincent said, "and we will go back together. There's a special train going through with ammunition, and as everything will make way for that, it will not be long behind the 4 o'clock, and likely enough may pass it on the way. There is a horse box attached to it, and I only take one horse, so there'll be room for yours." "I haven't brought my horse down," Harry Furniss said, "but I will certainly go with you by the 10 o'clock. Then we can have a long talk. I don't think I've seen you since the day you asked me to lend you my boat 2 years ago." "Can you spare me 2 hours now?" Vincent asked. "You'll do me a very great favour if you will." Harry Furniss looked at his watch. "It is 11 o'clock now. We have a lot of people to lunch at 1:30, and I must be back by then." "You can manage that easy enough," Vincent replied. "In 2 hours from the time we leave here you can be at home." "I'm your man then, Vincent. Just wait 5 minutes. I have to see someone in here." A few minutes later Harry Furniss came out again and mounted. "Now which way, Vincent? And what is it you want me for?" "The way is to Jackson's place at the Cedars. The why I will tell you about as we ride." Vincent then recounted his feud with the Jacksons, of which, up to the date of the purchase of Dinah Morris, his friend was aware, having been present at the sale. He now heard of the attack upon young Jackson by Tony, and of the disappearance of Dinah Morris. "I should not be at all surprised, Wingfield, if your surmises are correct, and that old scoundrel has carried off the girl to avenge himself upon Tony. Of course, if you could prove it, it would be a very serious offence, for the stealing of a slave, and by force too, is a crime with a very heavy penalty, and has cost men their lives before now. I don't see that you have anything like a positive proof, however strong a case of suspicion it may be. I don't see what you are going to say when you get there." "I am going to tell him that if he does not say what he has done with the girl, I will have his son arrested for treachery as soon as he sets foot in the Confederacy again." "Treachery?" Furness said in surprise. "What treachery has he been guilty of? I saw that he was one of those who escaped with you, and I rather wondered at the time at you two being mixed up together in anything. I heard that he had been recaptured through some black fellow that had been his slave, but I did not read the account. Have you got proof of what you say?" "Perhaps no proof that would hold in a court of law," Vincent replied, "but proof enough to make it absolute certainty to my mind." Vincent then gave an account of their escape, and of the anonymous denunciation of himself and Dan. "Now," he said, "no one but Dan knew of the intended escape. No one knew what clothes he had purchased. No one could possibly have known that I was to be disguised as a preacher and Dan as my servant. Therefore the information must have been given by Jackson. I have not the least doubt that the blackguard did give it Wingfield, but there is no proof." "I consider that there is a proof, an absolute and positive proof," Vincent asserted, "because no one else could have known it." "Well, you see that as a matter of fact the other officer did know it and might possibly have given the information." "But why should he? The idea is absurd. He never had a quarrel with me, and he owed his liberty to me." "Just so, Wingfield. I am as certain that it was Jackson as you are, because I know the circumstances. But you see there is no more absolute proof against one man than against the other. It is true that you had a quarrel with Jackson some 2 years before, but you see you had made it up and become friends in prison, so much so that you selected him from a score of others in the same room to be the companion of your flight. You and I, who know Jackson, can well believe him guilty of an act of gross ingratitude, and treachery, but people who do not know would hardly credit it as possible that a man could be such a villain. The defence he would set up would be that, in the first place, there is no shadow of evidence that he more than the other turned traitor. In the second place, he would be sure to say that such an accusation against a Confederate officer is too monstrous and preposterous to be entertained for a moment, and that doubtless your negro, although he denies the fact, really chattered about his doings to the negroes he was lodging with, and that it was through them that someone got to know of the disguise you would wear. We know that it wasn't so, Wingfield, but 99 men out of 100 in the South would rather believe that a negro had chattered than a Confederate officer had been guilty of a gross act of treachery and ingratitude." Vincent was silent. He felt that what his companion said was the truth, and that a weapon by which he had hoped to force the elder Jackson into saying what he had done with Dinah would probably fail in its purpose. The old man was too astute not to perceive that there was no real proof against his son, and would therefore be unlikely at once to admit that he had committed a serious crime and to forgo his revenge. "I will try at any rate," he said at last, "and if he refuses I will publish the story in the papers. When the fellow gets back from Yankee land he may either call me out or demand a court of inquiry. I may not succeed in getting a verdict from 12 white men, but I think I can convince everyone of our own class that the fellow did it, and when this battle that is expected is over I've got 3 months' leave, and I will move heaven and earth to find that woman, and if I do, Jackson will either have to bolt or stand a trial, with the prospect of 10 years' imprisonment if he is convicted. In either case we are not likely to have his son about here again, and if he did venture back and brought an action against me, his chance of getting damages would be a small one." Another half-hour's ride brought them to the Cedars. They dismounted at the house, and fastening their horses to the portico, knocked at the door. It was opened by a negro. "Tell your master," Vincent said, "that Mr. Wingfield wishes to speak to him." Andrew Jackson himself came to the door. "To what do I owe the very great pleasure of this visit, Mr. Wingfield?" he said grimly. "I have come to ask you what you've done with Dinah Morris, whom, I have every ground for believing, you have caused to be kidnapped from my mother's house." "That is a serious charge, young gentleman," Andrew Jackson said, "and one that I shall call upon you to justify in the law courts. Men are not to be charged with criminal actions, even by young gentlemen of good Virginian families. I shall be quite ready to meet you there, Mr. Jackson, whenever you choose, but my visit here is rather to give you an opportunity of escaping the consequences that will follow your detection as the author of the crime, for I warn you that I will bring the crime home to you, whatever it costs me in time and money. My offer is this: produce the woman and her child, and not only shall no prosecution take place, but I will remain silent concerning a fact which affects the honour of your son." Andrew Jackson's face had been perfectly unmoved during this conversation until he heard the allusion to his son. Then his face changed visibly. "I know nothing concerning which you can attack the honour of my son, Mr. Wingfield," he said, with an effort to speak as unconcernedly as before. "My charge is as follows," Vincent said quietly. "I was imprisoned at Elmira with a number of other officers, among them your son. Thinking that it was time for the unpleasantness that had been existing between us to come to an end, I offered him my hand. This he accepted, and we became friends. A short time afterwards a mode of escape offered itself to me, and I proved the sincerity of my feelings towards him by offering to him and another officer the means of sharing my escape. This they accepted. Once outside the walls, I furnished them with disguises that had been prepared for them, assuming myself that of a minister. We then separated, going in different directions, I myself being accompanied by my negro servant, to whose fidelity I owed our escape. 2 days afterwards an anonymous writer communicated to the police the fact that I had escaped in the disguise of a minister, and was accompanied by my black servant. This fact was only known to the negro, myself, and the 2 officers. My negro, who had released me, was certainly not my betrayer. The other officer could certainly have no motive for betraying me. There remains, therefore, only your son, whose hostility to me was notorious, and who had expressed himself with bitterness against me on many occasions, and among others in the hearing of my friend Mr. Furniss here. Such being the case, it is my intention to charge him before the military authorities with this act of treachery. But, as I have said, I am willing to forego this, and to keep silence as to your conduct with reference to my slave Dinah Morris, if you will restore her and her child uninjured to the house from which you caused her to be taken." The sallow cheeks of the old planter had grown a shade paler as he listened to Vincent's narrative, but now he burst out in angry tones. "How dare you, sir, bring such an infamous accusation against my son? An accusation like that against myself, wholly unsupported by a shred of evidence? Doubtless your negro had confided to some of his associates his plans for assisting you to escape from prison, and it is from one of these that the denunciation has come. Go, sir, report where you will what lies and fables you've invented, but be assured that I and my son will seek out compensation for such gross libels in the courts." "Very well, sir," Vincent said, as he prepared to mount his horse. "If you will take the trouble to look in the papers tomorrow, you will see that your threats of action for libel have no effect whatever upon me." "The man is as hard as a rock, Wingfield," Furniss said as they rode off together. "He wilted a little when you were telling your story, but the moment he saw you had no definite proofs he was, as I expected he would be, ready to defy you. What shall you do now?" "I shall ride back into Richmond again and give a full account of my escape from the jail, and state that I firmly believe that the information as to my disguise was given by Jackson, and that it was the result of a personal hostility which, as many young men in Richmond are well aware, has existed for some time between us." "Well, you must do as you like, Wingfield, but I think it will be a risky business." "It may be so," Vincent said, "but I have little doubt that long before Jackson is exchanged I shall have discovered Dinah, and shall prosecute Jackson for theft and kidnapping, in which case the young man will hardly venture to prosecute me, or indeed to show his face in this part of the country." That evening the 2 young officers started for the front, and the next morning the Richmond papers came out with a sensational heading: "Alleged gross act of treachery and ingratitude by a Confederate officer." It was the 10th of December when Vincent joined the army at Fredericksburg. He reported himself to General Stuart, who received him with great cordiality. "You are just in time, Wingfield," he said. "I believe that in another 24 hours the battle will be fought. They have for the last 2 days been moving about in front, and apparently want us to believe that they intend to cross somewhere below the town. But all the news we get from our spies is to the effect that these are only feints, and that they intend to throw a bridge across here. We know, anyhow, that they've got 2 trains concealed opposite, near the river. Burnside is likely to find it a hard nut to crack. Of course they are superior in number to us, as they are aware, but as we've always beat them well on level ground, I do not think their chances of getting up these heights are by any means hopeful. Then, too, their change of commanders is against them. McClellan fought a drawn battle against us at Antietam, and showed himself a really able general in the operations in front of Richmond. The army have confidence in him, and he is by far the best man they've got so far. But the fools at Washington have now for the second time displaced him because they are jealous of him. Burnside has shown himself a good man in minor commands, but I don't think he is equal to command such a vast army as this. And besides, we know from our friends at Washington that he has protested against this advance across the river, but has been overruled. You will see Fredericksburg will add another to the long list of our victories." Vincent shared a tent with another officer of the same rank in General Stuart's staff. They sat chatting till late, and it was still dark when they were suddenly aroused by an outbreak of musketry down at the river. "The general was right," Captain Longmore, Vincent's companion, exclaimed. "They are evidently throwing a bridge across the river, and the fire we hear comes from 2 regiments of Mississippians who are posted down in the town under Barksdale." It was but the work of a minute to throw on their clothes and hurry out. The night was dark, and a heavy fog hung over the river. A perfect roar of musketry came from the valley. Drums and bugles were sounding all along the crest. At the same moment they issued out, General Stuart came out from his tent, which was close by. "Is that you, Longmore? Jump on your horse and ride down to the town. Bring back news of what is going on." A few minutes later an officer rode up. Some wood had been thrown on the fire, and by its light Vincent recognized Stonewall Jackson. "Have you any news for us?" he asked. "Not yet. I have sent an officer down to inquire. The enemy have been trying to bridge the river." "I suppose so," Jackson replied. "I have ordered one of my brigades to come to the head of the bank as soon as they can be formed up, to help Barksdale if need be, but I don't want to take them down into the town. It is commanded by all the hills on the opposite side, and we know they have brought up also all their artillery there." In a few minutes Captain Longmore returned. "The enemy have thrown 2 pontoon bridges across, one above and one below the old railway bridge. The Mississippians have driven them back once, but they are pushing on the work and will soon get it finished. But General Barksdale bids me report that with the force at his command he can repulse any attempt to cross." The light was now breaking in the east, but the roar of musketry continued under the canopy of fog. General Lee, Longstreet, and the others had now arrived upon the spot, and Vincent was surprised that no orders were issued for troops to reinforce those under General Barksdale. Presently the sun rose, and as it gained in power the fog slowly lifted, and it was seen that 2 pontoon bridges were complete. But the fire of the Mississippians was so heavy that although the enemy several times attempted to cross, they recoiled before it. Suddenly a gun was fired from the opposite height, and at the signal more than 100 pieces of artillery opened fire upon the town. Many of the inhabitants had left as soon as the musketry fire began, but the slopes behind it soon presented a sad spectacle. Men, women, and children poured out from the town, bewildered with the din, and terrified by the storm of shot and shell that crashed into it. Higher and higher the crowd of fugitives made their way until they reached the crest. Among them were weeping women and crying children, many of them in the scantiest attire, and carrying such articles of dress and valuables as they had caught up when startled by the terrible rain of missiles. In a very few minutes smoke began to rise over the town, followed by tongues of flame, and in half an hour the place was on fire in a score of places. All day the bombardment went on without cessation, and Fredericksburg crumbled into ruins. Still, in spite of this terrible fire, the Mississippians clung to the burning town amid crashing walls, falling chimneys, and shells exploding in every direction. As night fell, the enemy poured across the bridges, and Barksdale, contesting every foot of ground, fell back through the burning city and took up a position behind a stone wall in its rear. Throughout the day not a single shot had been fired by the Confederate artillery, which was very inferior in power to that of the enemy. General Lee had no wish finally to hinder the passage of the Federals, the stubborn resistance of Barksdale's force being only intended to give him time to concentrate all his army as soon as he knew for certain the point at which the enemy was going to cross, and he did not wish therefore to risk the destruction of any of his batteries by calling down the Federal fire upon them. During the day the troops were all brought up into position. Longstreet was on the left and Jackson on the right, while the guns, 47 in number, were in readiness to take up their post in the morning on the slopes in front of them. On the extreme right General Stuart was posted with his cavalry and horse artillery. The night passed quietly, and by daybreak the troops were all drawn up in their positions. As soon as the sun rose, it was seen that during the night the enemy had thrown more bridges across, and that the greater portion of the army was already over. They were, indeed, already in movement against the Confederate position, their attack being directed towards the portion of the line held by Jackson's division. General Stuart gave orders to Major Pelham, who commanded his horse artillery, and who immediately brought up the guns and began the battle by opening fire on the flank of the enemy. The guns of the northern batteries at once replied, and for some hours the artillery duel continued, the Federal guns doing heavy execution. For a time attacks were threatened from various points, but about 10 o'clock, when the fog lifted, a mass of some 55,000 troops advanced against Jackson. They were suffered to come within 800 yards before a gun was fired, and then 14 guns opened up upon them with such effect that they fell back in confusion. At 1 o'clock another attempt was made, covered by a tremendous fire of artillery. For a time the columns of attack were kept at bay by the fire of the Confederate batteries, but they advanced with great resolution, pushed their way through Jackson's first line, and forced them to fall back. Jackson brought up his second line, and drove the enemy back with great slaughter, until his advance was checked by the fire of the northern artillery. All day the fight went on, the Federals attempting to crush the Confederate artillery by the weight of their fire, in order that their infantry columns might again advance. But although outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, the Confederate guns were worked with great resolution, and the day passed and darkness began to fall without their retiring from the positions they had taken up. Just at sunset General Stuart ordered all the batteries on the right to advance. This they did, and opened their fire on the northern infantry with such effect that these fell back to the position near the town that they had occupied in the morning. On the left an equally terrible battle had raged all day, but here the northern troops were compelled to cross open ground between the town and the base of the hill, and suffered so terribly from the fire that they never succeeded in reaching the Confederate front. Throughout the day the Confederates held their position with such ease that General Lee considered the affair as nothing more than a demonstration of force to feel his position, and expected an even sterner battle on the following day. Jackson's first and second lines, composed of less than 15,000 men, had repulsed without difficulty the divisions of Franklin and Hooker, 55,000 strong, while Longstreet, with about the same force, had never been really pressed by the enemy, although on that side they had a force of over 50,000 men. In the morning the northern army was seen drawn up in battle array as if to advance for fresh assault, but no movement was made. General Burnside was in favour of a fresh attack, but the generals commanding the various divisions felt that their troops, after the repulse the day before, were not equal to the work, and were unanimously of the opinion that the second assault should not be attempted. After remaining for some hours in order of battle, they fell back into the town, and 2 days later the whole army recrossed the Rappahannock River. The loss of the Confederates was 1,800 men, who were for the most part killed or wounded by the enemy's artillery, while the Federal loss was no less than 13,771. General Burnside soon afterwards resigned his command, and General Hooker, an officer of the same politics as the President and his advisers, was appointed to succeed him. The cavalry had not been called upon to act during the day, and Vincent's duties were confined to carrying orders to the commanders of the various batteries of artillery posted in that part of the field, as these had all been placed under General Stuart's orders. He had many narrow escapes by shot and fragments of shells, but passed through the day uninjured. General Lee had been blamed for not taking advantage of his victory and falling upon the Federals on the morning after the battle, but although such an assault might possibly have been successful, he was conscious of his immense inferiority in force, and his troops would have been compelled to have advanced to the attack across ground completely swept by the fire of the magnificently served northern artillery posted upon their commanding heights. He was moreover ignorant of the full extent of the loss he had inflicted upon the enemy, and expected a renewed attack by them. He was therefore doubtless unwilling to risk the results of the victory he had gained, and of the victory he expected to gain, should the enemy renew their attack, by a movement which might not be successful, and which would at any rate have cost him a tremendous loss of men, and men were already becoming scarce in the Confederacy. As soon as the enemy had gone back across the river, and it was certain that there was little chance of another forward movement on their part for a considerable time, Vincent showed to General Stuart the permit he had received to return home until the spring on leave, and at once received the general's permission to retire from the staff for a time. He He had not been accompanied by Dan on his railway journey to the front, having left him behind with instructions to endeavour by every means to find some clue as to the direction in which Dinah had been carried off. He telegraphed on his way home the news of his coming, and found Dan at the station waiting for him. "Well, Dan, have you obtained any news?" he asked as soon as his horse had been removed from its box, and he had mounted and at foot pace left the station, with Dan walking beside him. "No, sir. I have done my best, but I cannot find anything. The niggers at Jackson's all say that no strangers have been there with the old man for a long time before that day that Dinah was carried off. I've been over there, massa, and have talked with the hands at the house. They all say that no one been there for a month. Me sure that they tell no lie about it, because they all hate Massa Jackson like poison. Then the lawyer, he put the advertisement you told him in the papers. $500 to whoever would give information about the carrying off of a female slave from Missy Wingfield, or that would lead to the discovery of her hiding place. But no answer come. We heard Missy Wingfield say so last night." "That's bad, Dan, but I hardly expected anything better. I felt sure the old fox would have taken every precaution, knowing what a serious business it would be for him if it were found out. Now I'm back, I will take the matter up myself, and we will see what we can do. I wish I could have set about it the day after she was carried away. It is more than a fortnight ago now, and that will make it much more difficult than it would have been had it been begun at once." "Well, Vincent, so you've come back to us undamaged this time," his mother said after the first greeting. "We were very anxious when the news came that a great battle had been fought last Friday, but when we heard the next morning the enemy had been repulsed so easily, we were not so anxious, although it was not until this morning that the list of killed and wounded was published, and our minds set at rest. No, mother, it was a tremendous artillery battle, but it was a little more than that, at least on our side. But I've never heard anything at all like it from sunrise to sunset. But, after all, an artillery fire is more frightening than dangerous, except at comparatively close quarters. The enemy must have fired at least 50 shots for every man that was hit. I counted several times, and there were fully 100 shots a minute. I don't think it lessened much the whole day. I should think they must have fired 200 or 300 rounds, at least, from every gun. The roar was incessant, and what with the din they made, and the replies of our own artillery, and the bursting of shells, and the rattle of musketry, the din at times was almost bewildering. Wildfire was hit with a piece of shell, but fortunately it was not a very large one, and he's not much the worse for it. But the shock knocked him off his legs. Of course, I went down with him, and thought for a moment that I'd been hit myself. No. It was by far the most hollow affair we've had. The enemy fought obstinately enough, but without the slightest spirit or dash, and only once did they get up anywhere near our line, and then they went back a good deal quicker than they came." "And now you are going to be with us for 3 months, Vincent?" "I hope so, mother. At least, if they do not advance again, I shall be here off and on. I mean to go and find Dinah Morris if it's possible, and if I can obtain the slightest clue, I shall follow it up and go wherever it may lead me." "Well, we will spare you for that, Vincent. As you know, I did not like your mixing yourself up in that business 2 years ago, but it is altogether different now. The woman was very willing and well conducted, and I had got to be really fond of her. But putting that aside, it's intolerable that such a piece of insolence as the stealing of one of our slaves should go unpunished. Therefore, if you do find any clue to the affair, we will not grumble at your following it up, even if it does take you away from home for a short time. By the by, we had letters this morning from a certain young lady in Georgia enclosing her photograph, and I rather fancy there is one for you somewhere." "Where is it, mother?" Vincent asked, jumping from his seat. "Let me think," Mrs. Wingfield replied. "Did either of you girls put it away, or where can it have been stowed?" The girls both laughed. "Now, Vincent, what offer do you make for the letter?" "Well, we won't tease you," Annie went on as Vincent gave an impatient exclamation mark. "Another time we might do so, but as you've just come back safely to us, I don't think it will be fair, especially as this is the very first letter. Here it is." And she took out of the work-box before her the missive Vincent was so eager to receive. End of chapter 15. With Lee in Virginia by G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton Miranda, New Zealand. Chapter 16. The Search for Dinah. "By the by, Vincent," Mrs. Wingfield remarked next morning at breakfast, "I have parted with Pearson." "I'm glad to hear it, mother. What? Did you discover at last that he was a scamp?" "Several things that occurred shook my confidence in him, Vincent. The accounts were not at all satisfactory, and it happened quite accidentally that when I was talking one day with Mr. Robertson, who, as you know, is a great speculator in tobacco, I said that I should grow no more tobacco, as it really fetched nothing. He replied that it would be a pity to give it up, for so little was now cultivated that the price was rising, and the orangery tobacco always fetched top prices. I think the price I paid for your crop this year must at any rate have paid for the labour, that is to say, paid for the keep of the slaves and something over." He then mentioned the price he had given, which was certainly a good deal higher than I had imagined. I looked at my accounts next morning and found that Pearson had only credited me with 1/3 of the amount he must have received, so I at once dismissed him. Indeed, I had been thinking of doing so some little time before, for money is so scarce and the price of produce so low that I felt I could not afford to pay as much as I have been giving him. "I'm afraid I've been drawing rather heavily, mother," Vincent put in. "I have plenty of money, Vincent. Since your father's death we have had much less company than before, and I have not spent my income. Besides, I have a considerable sum invested in house property and other securities, but I have, of course, since the war began, been subscribing towards the expenses of the war, for the support of hospitals and so on. I thought at a time like this I ought to keep my expenses down at the lowest point, and to give the balance of my income to the state." "How did Jonas take his dismissal, mother?" "Not very pleasantly," Mrs. Wingfield replied, "especially when I told him that I had discovered he was robbing me. However, he knew better than to say much, for he has not been in good odour about here for some time. After the fighting near here there were reports that he had been in communication with the Yankees. He spoke to me about it at the time, but as it was a mere matter of rumour, originating no doubt from the fact that he was a Northern man by birth, I paid no attention to them." "It is likely enough to be true," Vincent said. "I always distrusted the vehemence with which he took the Confederate side. How long ago did this happen?" "It is about a month since I dismissed him." "So lately as that? Then I should not at all be surprised if he had some hand in carrying off Dinah. I know he was in communication with Jackson, for I once saw them together in the street, and I fancied at the time that it was through him that Jackson learned that Dinah was here. It is an additional clue to inquire into, anyhow. Do you know what's become of him since he left you?" "No, I've heard nothing at all about him, Vincent, from the day I gave him a cheque for his pay in this room. Farrell, who was under him, is now in charge of the orangery. He may possibly know something of his movements." "I think Farrell is an honest fellow," Vincent said. "He was always about doing his work quietly, never bullying or shouting at the hands, and yet seeing that they did their work properly. I will ride out and see him at once." As soon as breakfast was over Vincent started, and found Farrell in the fields with the hands. "I'm glad to see you back, sir," the man said heartily. "Thank you, Farrell. I'm glad to be back, and I'm glad to find you in Pearson's place. I never liked the fellow, and never trusted him." "I did not like him myself, sir, though we always got on well enough together. He knew his work, and got as much out of the hands as anyone could do. But I did not like his way with them. They hated him." "Have you any idea where he went to after he left here?" "No, sir. He did not come back after he got his dismissal. He sent a man in a buggy with a note to me, asking me to send all his things over to Richmond. I expect he was afraid the news might get here as soon as he did, and that the hands would give him an unpleasant reception, as indeed I expect they would have done." "You don't know whether he has any friends anywhere in the Confederacy to whom he would be likely to go?" "I don't know about friends, sir, but I know he has told me that he was an overseer or partner, or something of that sort, in a small station down in the swamps of South Carolina. I should think, from things he has let drop, that the slaves must have had a bad time of it. I rather fancy he made the place too hot for him, and had to leave, but that was only my impression." "In that case he may possibly have made his way back there," Vincent said. "I have particular reasons for wishing to find out. You don't know anything about the name of the place?" The man shook his head. "He never mentioned the name in my hearing." "Well, I must try to find out, but I don't quite see how to set about it," Vincent said. "By the way, do you know where his clothes were sent to?" "Yes. The man said that he was to take them to Harker's Hotel. It's a second-rate hotel, not far from the railway station." "Thank you. That will help me. I know the house. It was formerly used by Northern drummers and people of that sort." After riding back to Richmond and putting up his horse, Vincent went to the hotel there. Although but a secondary hotel, it was well filled, for people from all parts of the Confederacy resorted to Richmond, and however much trade suffered, the hotels of the town did a good business. He first went up to the clerk in a little office at the entrance. "You had a man named Pearson," he said, "staying here about a month ago. Will you be good enough to tell me on what day he left?" The clerk turned to the register, and after a minute's examination he said, "He came on the 14th of November, and he left on the 20th. This was 2 days after the date on which Dinah had been carried off. In American hotels the halls are large and provided with seats, and are generally used as smoking and reading rooms by the male visitors to the hotel. At Harker's Hotel there was a small bar at the end of the hall, and a black waiter supplied the wants of the guests seated at the various little tables. Vincent seated himself at one of these, and ordered something to drink. As the negro placed it on the table, he said, "I'll give you $1 if you'll answer a few questions." "Very good, sir. That a mighty easy way to earn $1. "Do you remember, about a month ago, a man named Pearson being here?" The negro shook his head. "Me not know the names of the gentlemen, sir. What was the man like?" "He was tall and thin, with short hair and a grey goatee, a regular Yankee." "Me remember him, sir. There used to be plenty of that sort here. Don't see him much now. Me remember the man, sir, quite well. Used to pass most of the day here. Didn't seem to have nothing to do." "Was he always alone, or did he have many people here to see him?" "Once there were 2 men here with him, sir, sitting at that table over in the corner. Rough-looking fellows they were. In old times people like that wouldn't come to a 'spectable hotel, but now almost everyone got rough clothes, can't get no others, so one don't think nothing about it. But those fellows was rough-looking beside their clothes. Didn't like their looks nohow. They only came here once. They was the only strangers that came to see him. But once Master Jackson, me know him by sight, he came here and talked with him for a long time. Earnest sort of talk that seemed to be. They talk in low voice, and I noticed they stopped talking when anyone sat down near him." "You don't know where he went to from here, I suppose?" "No, sir. That me not compartment. Perhaps the outside porter will know. Like enough he'd take his things in hand truck to station. You like to see him, sir?" "Yes, I should like to have a minute's talk with him. Here is your $1." The waiter rang a bell, and a minute later the outdoor porter presented himself. "You remember taking some things to station for a tall man with grey goatee, Pomp?" the waiter asked. "It was more than 3 weeks ago. I think he went before it was light in the morning. Me seem to remember that." The negro nodded. "Me remember him very well, sir. 3 heavy boxes in one bag, and you're going to give me a $25 for taking them to the station. Mighty mean man, that." "Do you know what train he went by?" "Yes, sir. It was the 6 o'clock train for the South." "You can't find out where his luggage was checked for?" "I can go down to the station, sir, and see if I can find out. Some of the men may remember." "Here is $1 for yourself," Vincent said, "and another to give any of the men who can give you news. When you've found out, come and tell me. Here's my card and address." "Very well, sir. Next time we go to the station to find out about it for sure, if anyone remembered that fellow." In the evening the negro called at the house and told Vincent that he had ascertained that a man answering to his description and having luggage similar to that of Pearson had had it checked to Florence in South Carolina. Vincent now called Dan into his council and told him what he had discovered. The young negro had already been given proof of such intelligence that he felt sure his opinion would be of value. "They look very plain, sir," Dan said when Vincent was finished with his story. "Me no doubt that old rascal Jackson give money to Pearson to carry off the gal. Of course he did it just to take revenge upon Tony. Pearson he go into the plot because in the first place he vexed Missy Wingfield and you very much. In the second place because Jackson give him money. In the third place because he get hold of negro slave worth $1,000. That all quite clear. He not do it himself, but arrange with other fellows. And he stop quiet at hotel for 2 days after she gone, so that no one can suspect his having hand in the affair. That is just how I make it out, Dan. Now he's gone off to join them." Dan thought for some time. "Perhaps they join him there, sir. Perhaps not. Perhaps him send baggage on there and get out somewhere on the road and meet them." "That is likely enough, Dan. No doubt Dinah was taken away in a cart or a buggy. As she left 2 days before he did, they may have gone from 40 to 60 miles along the road to some place where he may have joined them. The men who carried her off may either have come back or gone on with him. If they wanted to go south, they would have gone on. If they did not, he would probably have only hired them to carry her off and hand her over to him when he overtook them. I'll look at the timetable and see where the train stops. It's a fast train, I see," he said after consulting it. "It stops at Petersburg, 15 miles on, and at Hicks Ford, which is about 50 miles. I should think the second place was most likely, as the cart could easily have got there in 2 days. Now, Dan, you had better start tomorrow morning and spend 2 days there if necessary. Find out if you can if anyone noticed on the 20th of last month, if anyone noticed a vehicle of any kind with 2 rough men in it, and with perhaps a negro woman. She might not have been noticed, for she may have been lying tied up in the bottom of the cart, although it's more likely they frightened her by threats into sitting up quiet with them. They are sure not to have stopped at any decent hotel, but will have gone to some small place, probably just outside the town. I will go with you to Mr. Renfrew the first thing in the morning, and get him to draw up a paper testifying that you are engaged in lawful business, and are making inquiries with a view to discovering a crime which has been committed, and recommending you to the assistance of the police in any town you may go to. Then, if you go with that to the head constable at Hicks Ford, he will tell you which are the places at which such fellows as these would have been likely to put up for the night, and perhaps send a policeman with you to make inquiries. If you get any news, telegraph to me at once. I will start by the 6 o'clock train on the following morning. Do you be on the platform to meet me, and we can then go either straight on to Florence, or, should there be any occasion, I will get out there, but I don't think that is likely. Pearson himself will to a certainty sooner or later go to Florence to get his luggage, and the only real advantage we shall get if your inquiries are successful will be to find out for certain whether he is concerned in the affair. We shall then only have to follow his traces from Florence." 2 days later Mr. Renfrew received a telegram from the head constable at Hicks Ford. "The 2 men with cart spent day here 20th ult. Were joined that morning by another man, negro says Pearson. 1 man returned afternoon Richmond. Pearson and the other drove off in buggy. A young negress and child were with them. Is there anything I can do?" Mr. Renfrew telegraphed back to request that the men who were kidnapping the female slave should if possible be traced, and the direction they took ascertained. He then sent the message across to Vincent, who at once went to his office. "Now," the lawyer said, "you must do nothing rashly in this business, Vincent. They are at the best of time a pretty rough lot at the edge of these Carolina swamps, and at present things are likely to be worse than usual. If you were to go alone on such an errand, you would almost certainly be shot. In the first place, these fellows would not give up a valuable slave without a struggle, and in the next place, they have committed a very serious crime. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary that you should go armed with legal powers and backed by the force of the law. In the first place, I will draw up an affidavit and sign it myself, to the effect that a female slave, the property of Vincent Wingfield, has, with her male child, been kidnapped and stolen by Jonas Pearson and others acting association with him, and that we have reason to know that she has been conveyed into South Carolina. This I will get witnessed by a justice of the peace, and will then take it up to Government House. There I will get the usual official request to the Governor of South Carolina to issue orders that the aid of the law shall be given to you in recovering the said Dinah Morris and her child, and arresting her abductors. You will obtain an order to this effect from the Governor, and armed with it you will, as soon as you have discovered where the woman is, call upon the sheriff of the county to aid you in recovering her, and in arresting Pearson and his associates." "Thank you, sir. That will certainly be the best way. I run plenty of risk in doing my duty as an officer of the state, and I have no desire whatever to throw my life away at the hands of ruffians such as Pearson and his allies." 2 hours later Vincent received from Mr. Renfrew the official letter to the Governor of South Carolina, and at 6 o'clock next morning started for Florence. On the platform of the station at Hicks Ford Dan was waiting for him. "Jump into the car at the end, Dan. I will come to you there, and you can tell me all the news. We're going straight on to Columbia. Now, Dan," Vincent went on when he joined him, for in no part of the United States were negroes allowed to travel in any but the cars set apart for them, "what is your news? The chief constable telegraphed that they had, as we expected, been joined by Pearson here." "Yes, sir, they were here for sure. When I get I go straight to the constable and tell him that I was in search of 2 men who had kidnapped Captain Wingfield's slave. The head constable, he Richmond man, and of course knew all about the family. So we take up the matter at once and send constable with me to several places where it likely that the fellows had put up, but we couldn't find nothing about them. Then next morning we will go out again to village 4 mile out of the town on the north road, and there we found sure enough that 2 men with negro wench and child had stopped there. She seemed very unhappy and cry all the time. The men say they bought her at Richmond, and show the constable of the village the paper that they bought a female slave Sally Moore and her child. The constable speak to woman, but she seemed frightened out of her life and saying nothing. They drive off with her early in the morning. Then we make inquiries at the town again, and at the station. We find that a man like Pearson got out. He had only little handbag with him. He asked one of the men at the station which was the way to the north road. Then we find that one of the constables had seen a horse and cart with 2 men in it, with negro woman and child. One of the men looked like Yankee. That what make him take notice of it. We suppose the other man went back to Richmond again." "That's all right, Dan, and you've done capitally. Now at Florence we will take up the hunt. It's a long way down there, and if they drive all the way, as I hope they will, it will take them a fortnight, so that we shall have gained a good deal of time on them. The people at the station are sure to remember the 3 boxes that lay there for so long without being claimed. Of course, they may have driven up only till they got fairly out of reach. Then they may either have sold the horse and trap, or the fellow Pearson has with him may have driven it back. But I should think they would most likely sell it. In that case, they would not be able to move for more than a week, from the time when they left Richmond to the time they took the train again for the south. However, whether they've got a fortnight or 3 weeks' start of us will not make much difference. With the description we can give of Pearson, and the fact there was a negress and child, and those 3 boxes, we ought to be able to trace him." It was 12 at night when the train arrived at Florence. As nothing could be done until next morning, Vincent went to a hotel. As soon as the railway officials were likely to be at their offices, he was at the station again. The tip of $1 secured the attention of the man in the baggage room. 3 boxes and a black bag came on here a month ago, you say, and lay here certainly 4 or 5 days, perhaps a good deal longer? Of course I remember them. Stood up in that corner there. They'd been checked right through. I'll look at the books and see what day they went. I don't remember what sort of men fetched them away. Maybe I was busy at the time and my mate gave them out. However, I will look first and see when they went. What day d'ye say they got here?" "They came by train that left Richmond at 6 o'clock on the morning of the 20th. "Then they got in late that night or early next morning." "Ah, the train was on time that day, and got in at 9:30 at night. Here they are, 3 boxes and a bag, numbers 15020. Went out on the 28th. Yeah, that's right enough. Now I'll just ask my mate if he remembers about their going out." The other man was called. Oh yes, he remembered quite well the 3 boxes standing in the corner. They went out sometime in the afternoon. It was just after the train came in from Richmond. He noticed the man that asked for them. He got him to help carry out the boxes and put them into a cart. Yes, he remembered there was another man with him, and a negress with a child. He wondered at the time what they were up to, but supposed it was all right. Yes, he didn't mind trying to find out who had hired out a cart for the job. Dessay he could find out by tomorrow. At any rate, he would try. $5 are worth earning anyway. Having put this matter in train, Vincent, leaving Dan at Florence, went down at once to Charleston. Here, after 24 hours' delay, he obtained a warrant for the arrest of Jonas Pearson and others on the charge of kidnapping, and then returned to Florence. He found that the railway man had failed in obtaining any sort of information as to the cart, and concluded it must have come in from the country on purpose to meet the train. At any rate, Vincent said, it must be within a pretty limited range of country. The railway makes a bend from Wilmington to this place, and then down to Charleston, so this is really the nearest station to only a small extent of country. "That's so," the railway man said. He had heard from Dan a good deal about the case, and had got thoroughly interested in it. "Either Marion or Kingstree would be nearer, one way or the other, to most of that swamp country, So it can't be as far off as Conwayborough on the north or Georgetown on the south, and it must lie somewhere between Jeffries Creek and Lynch's Creek. Anyhow, it would be in Marion County, that's pretty nigh sure. So if I were you, I would take rail back to Marion Courthouse and see the sheriff there and have a talk over the matter with him. You haven't got much to go on, because this man you're after has been away here for a good many years and won't be known. Besides, likely enough he went by some other name down here. Anyhow, the sheriff can put you up on the roads and the best way of going about the job." "I think that would be the best way," Vincent said. "We shall be able to see the county map and learn of the geography of the place too. You've got your sharpshooters with you, I suppose, because you're as likely as not to have to use them." "Yes, we've got a Colt, each of us, and as I have had a good deal of practice, it would be awkward for Pearson if he gives me occasion to use it." "After what I hear of the matter," the man said, "I should say your best plan is to just shoot him at sight. It's what would serve him right. You bet there will be no fuss over it. It will save you a lot of trouble anyway." Vincent laughed. "My advice is good," the man went on earnestly. "They're a rough lot down there, and hang together. You'll have to do it sudden, whatever you do, or you get the whole neighborhood up agin you." On reaching Marion Courthouse, they sought out the sheriff, produced the warrant signed by the state's authority, and explained the whole circumstances. "I'm ready to aid you any way I can," the sheriff said when he concluded. "But the question is, where has the fellow got to? You see, he may be anywhere in this tract," and he pointed out a circle on the map of the county that hung against the wall. "That is about 50 miles across, and a pretty nasty spot, I can tell you. There are wide swamps on both sides of the creek, and rice grounds and all sorts. There ain't above 3 or 4 villages altogether, but there may be 200 or 300 little plantations scattered about, some big and some little. We haven't got anything to guide us in the slightest, not a thing as I can see. The man who was working under Pearson, when he was with us, told me he had got the notion that he had to leave on account of some trouble here. Possibly that might afford a clue." "It might do so," the sheriff said. "When did he come to you?" "I think it was when I was 6 or 7 years old." "That would be about 12 or 13 years ago. But of course he may not have come direct to us after leaving there." "We can look anyway," the sheriff said, and opening a chest he took out a number of volumes containing the records of his predecessors. 12 years ago! Well, this is the volume. Now, Captain Wingfield, I've got some other business in hand that will take me a couple of hours. I'll leave you out this volume, and the one before it, and the one after it, and if you like to go through them, you may come across the description of some man wanted that agrees with that of the man you're in search of." It took Vincent 2 hours and a half to go through the volume, but he met with no description answering to that of Pearson. "I will go through the first 6 months of the next year," he said to himself, taking up that volume, "and the last 6 months of the year before." The second volume yielded no better result, and he then turned back to the first of the 3 books. Beginning in July, he read steadily on until he came to December. Scarcely had he begun the record of that month than he uttered an exclamation of satisfaction. "December 2nd. Information laid against gang at Porter's Station near Lynch's Creek, charged with several robberies and murders in different parts of the county. Long been suspected of having stills in the swamps. Gang consists of 4 besides Porter himself. Names of gang: Jack Haverly, Jim Corbin, and John and James Porter. Ordered out posse to start tomorrow. December 5th. Returned from Porter Station. Surprised the gang. They resisted. Haverly, Corbin, and James Porter shot. John Porter escaped and took to swamp. 4 of posse wounded. 1, William Hannay, killed. Circulated description of John Porter through the county. Tall and lean. When 15 years old, shot a man in a brawl and went north. Has been absent 13 years. Assumed the appearance of a northern man and speaks with Yankee twang. Father was absent at the time of attack. Captured 3 hours after. Declares he knows nothing of doings of the gang. Haverly and Corbin were friends of his son's. Came and went when they liked. Will be tried on the 15th. On the 16th there was another entry. William Porter sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment for giving shelter to a gang of robbers. Evidence wanting to show he took any actual part in their crimes. The sheriff had been in and out several times during the 5 hours that Vincent's search had taken up. When he returned again, Vincent pointed out the entry he had found. "I should not be at all surprised if that's our man," the sheriff said. "I know old Porter well, for he's still alive and bears a pretty bad reputation still, though we've never been able to bring him to book. I remember all the circumstances of that affair, for I served upon the posse. While Porter was in prison, his house was kept for him by a married daughter and her husband. There was a strong suspicion that the man was one of the gang too, but we couldn't prove it. They have lived there ever since. They've got 5 or 6 field hands, and are said to be well off. We have no doubt they've still got a still somewhere in the swamps. We've never been able to find it. I'll send a man off tomorrow to make inquiries whether any stranger has arrived there lately. Of course, Pearson will have not kept that name, and he will not have appeared as John Porter. He'll be arrested on a fresh warrant at once for his share in that former business. I think, Captain Wingfield, you'd better register at the hotel here under some other name. I don't suppose that he has any fear of being tracked here. Still, it is just possible his father may have got somebody here and at Florence to keep their eyes open and let him know if there are any inquiries being made by strangers about a missing negress. One cannot be too careful. If you got the least hint, his son and the woman would be hidden away in the swamps before we could get there, and there would be no saying when we could find him." Vincent took the sheriff's advice and entered his name in the hotel book as Mr. Vincent. Late in the evening the sheriff came round to him. "I have just sent summonses to 6 men. I'd rather had had 2 or 3 more, but young men are very scarce around here now, and as with you and myself that brings it up to 8. That ought to be sufficient, as these fellows will have no time to sum up any of their friends to their assistance. Have you a rifle, Captain Wingfield?" "No, I have a brace of revolvers." "They're useful enough for close work," the sheriff said, "but if they see us coming, and barricade their house and open fire upon us, you'll want something that carries further than a revolver. I can lend you a rifle as well as a horse if you'll accept them." Vincent accepted the offer with thanks. The next morning at daylight he went round to the sheriff's house, where 6 determined-looking men belonging to the town or neighbouring farms were assembled. Slinging the rifle that the sheriff had handed him across his back, Vincent at once mounted, and the party set off at a brisk trot. "My man came back half an hour ago," the sheriff said to Vincent as they rode along. "He found out that a man answering to your description arrived with another at Porter's about a fortnight ago, and is staying there still. Whether they brought a negress with them or not, no one seems to have noticed. However, there's not a shadow of doubt that's our man, and I shall be heartily glad to lay hold of him, for a brother of mine was badly wounded in that last affair, and though he lived some years afterwards he was never the same man again, so I've a personal interest in it, you see." "How far is it to Porter's?" "About 35 miles. We shall get there about 2 o'clock, I reckon. We're all pretty well mounted, and keep at this pace with a break or two till we get there. I propose that we dismount when we get within half a mile of the place. We will try and get hold of someone who knows the country well, and get him to lead 3 of us round the edge of the swamp to the back of the house. It stands within 50 yards of the swamp. I've no doubt they put it there so they might escape if pressed, and also to prevent their being observed going backwards and forwards to that still of theirs." This plan was followed out. A negro lad was found who, on the promise of a couple of dollars, agreed to act as guide. 3 of the party were then told to follow him, and the rest, after waiting for half an hour to allow them to make the detour, mounted their horses and rode down at a gallop to the house. When they were within a short distance of it, they heard a shout, and a man who was lounging near the door ran inside. Almost instantly they saw the shutters swing back across the windows, and when they drew up 50 yards from the door, the barrels of 4 rifles were pushed out through slits in the shutters. The sheriff held up his hand. "William Porter, I want a word with you." A shutter in an upper room opened, and an elderly man appeared with a rifle in his hand. "William Porter," the sheriff said, "I have a warrant for the arrest of 2 men now in your house on the charge of kidnapping a female slave, property of Captain Wingfield here. I have no proof that you had any share in the matter, or that you are aware that the slave was not honestly obtained. In the second place, I have a warrant for the arrest of your son, John Porter, now in your house, and passing recently under the name of Jonas Pearson, on the charge of resisting and killing the officers of the law on the 5th of December, 1851. I counsel you to hand over these men to me without resistance. You know what happened when your sons defied the law before, and what will happen now if you refuse compliance." "Yah!" the old man shouted. "Do you suppose we're going to give it to 5 men? Not if we know it. Now, I warn you, move yourself off while I let you, else you get a bullet in you before I count to 3. "Very well, then. You must take the consequences," the sheriff replied, and at once called the party to fall back. "We must dismount," he said in answer to Vincent's look of surprise. "They would riddle us here on horseback in the open. Besides, we must dismount to break down the door." They rode back a quarter of a mile and then dismounted. The sheriff took 2 heavy axes that hung from his saddle and handed them to 2 of the men. "I reckon we should have trouble," he said. "However, I hope we shan't have to use these. My idea is to crawl up through the cornfield until we're within shooting distance, and then to open fire at them loopholes. They've never taken the trouble to grub up the stumps, and each man must look out for shelter. I want to make it so hot for them they'll try to bolt to the swamp, and in that case they'll be covered by my men there. I told them not to fire until they got quite close, so they ought to dispose of 3 of them, and as they've got pistols they'll be able to master the others. Besides, directly we hear firing behind, we shall jump up and make a rush round. Do you, sir, and James Wilkins here stop in front. 2 of them might make a rush out behind, and the others, when they've drawn us off, bolt in front." Several shots were fired at the party as they made their way across to the end of the field, where the tall stalks of maize were still standing, though the corn had been gathered weeks before. As soon as they reached the shelter, they separated, each crawling through the maize until they arrived within 50 yards of the house. There were, as the sheriff had said, many stumps still standing, and each ensconced himself behind one of those, and began to reply the fire that the defenders had kept up whenever they saw a movement among the corn stalks. At such a distance the shutters were but of slight advantage to the defenders of the house. The assailants were all good shots, and the loopholes afforded excellent targets at such a distance. After a few shots had been fired from the house, the fire of the defenders ceased, the men within not daring to protrude the rifles through the loopholes, as every such appearance was instantly followed by a couple of shots from the corn patch. "Give me one of those axes," the sheriff said. "Now, Withers, do you make a rush with me to the door. Get your rifle loaded before you start, and have your revolver handy in your belt. Now, Captain Wingfield, do you and the other 2 keep a sharp lookout at the loopholes, and see they don't get a shot at us as we run. Now, Withers," said the sheriff as he ran forward. 2 rifles were protruded through the loopholes. Vincent and his companions fired at once. One of the rifles gave a sharp jerk and disappeared. The other was fired, and Withers dropped his axe, but still ran forward. The sheriff began an onslaught at the door, his companion's right arm being useless. A minute later the sharp crack of rifles was heard in the rear, and the sheriff and 2 men rushed in that direction, while Vincent and the other lay watching the door. Scarcely had the sheriff's party disappeared round the house than the door was thrown open, and Pearson ran out at full speed. Vincent leapt to his feet. "Surrender," he said, "or you're a dead man." Jonas paused for a moment with a loud imprecation, and then, levelling a revolver, fired. Vincent felt a moment's pain in the cheek, but before he could level his rifle his companion fired, and Pearson fell forward dead. A minute later the sheriff and his party ran round. "Have you got him?" he asked. "He'll give you no more trouble, Sheriff," the young man who fired said. "I fancy I put him plumb between the eyes. How about the others?" "Dick Matheson is killed. He got 2 bullets in his body. The other man is badly wounded. There are no signs of old Porter." They now advanced to the door, which stood open. As the sheriff entered there was a sharp report, and he fell back, shot through the heart. The rest made a rush forward. Another shot was fired, but this missed them, and before it could be repeated they had wrested the pistol from the hand of Matheson's wife. She was firmly secured, and then they entered the kitchen, where, crouched upon the floor, lay some 7 or 8 negro men and women in an agony of terror. Vincent's question, "Dinah, where are you?" was answered by a scream of delight, and Dinah, who had been covering her child with her body, leapt to her feet. "It's all right, Dinah," Vincent said, "but stay here. We haven't finished this business yet." "I fancy the old man's upstairs," one of the men said. "It was his rifle, I reckon, that disappeared when we fired." It was as he expected. Porter was found dead behind the loophole, a bullet having passed through his brain. The deputy sheriff, who was with the party, now took the command. A cart and horse were found in an outbuilding. In these the wounded man, who was one of those who had taken part in the abduction of Dinah, was placed, together with the female prisoner and the dead body of the sheriff. The negroes were told to follow, and the horses having been fetched, the party mounted and rode off to the next village, 5 miles on their way back. Here they halted for the night, and the next day went on to Marion Courthouse, Vincent hiring a cart for the conveyance of Dinah and the other women. It was settled that Vincent's attendance at the trial of the 2 prisoners would not be necessary, as the man would be tried for armed resistance to the law, and the woman for murdering the sheriff. The facts could be proved by other witnesses, and as there could be no doubt about obtaining convictions, it would be unnecessary to try the charge against the man for kidnapping. Next day, accordingly, Vincent started with Dinah and Dan for Richmond. 2 months afterwards he saw in the paper that Jane Matheson had been sentenced to imprisonment for life, the man to 14 years. End of chapter 16.
With Lee in Virginia by G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Chapter 17. Chancellorsville. The news of the fight between the sheriff's posse and the band at Lynch's Creek was telegraphed to the Richmond papers by their local agent upon the day after it occurred. The report said that Captain Wingfield, a young officer who had frequently distinguished himself, had followed the traces of a gang, one of whom was a notorious criminal who had evaded the pursuit of the law and escaped from the section 15 years earlier, and had, under an assumed name, been acting as overseer at Mrs. Wingfield's estate at the Orangery. These men had carried off a negress belonging to Mrs. Wingfield, and had taken her down south. Captain Wingfield, having obtained the assistance of the sheriff with a posse of determined men, rode to the place which served as headquarters for the gang. Upon being summoned to surrender, the men opened a fire upon the sheriff and his posse. A sharp fight ensued, in which the sheriff was killed and one of his men wounded, while the 4 members of the gang were either killed or taken prisoners. It was reported that a person occupying a position as a planter in the neighborhood of Richmond is connected with this gang. The reporter had obtained his news from Vincent, who had purposely refrained from mentioning the names of those who had fallen. He had already had a conversation with the wounded prisoner. The latter had declared that he had simply acted in the affair as he had been paid to do so by the man he knew in Richmond as Pearson, who told him that he wanted him to aid in carrying off a slave woman who was really his property, but had been fraudulently taken from him. He had heard him say that there was another interested party in the affair who had his own reasons for getting the woman out of the way, and had paid handsomely for the job. Who that other was, Pearson had never mentioned. Vincent saw that he had no absolute evidence against Jackson, and therefore purposefully suppressed the fact that Pearson was among the killed, in hopes that the paragraph would so alarm Jackson that he would at once decamp. His anticipations were entirely justified, for upon the day of his return to Richmond he saw a notice in the paper that the Cedars, with its field hands, houses, and all belongings to it, was for sale. He proceeded at once to the estate agent, and learned from him that Jackson had come in 2 days before, and had informed him that sudden and important business had called him away, and that he was starting at once for New York, where his presence was urgently required, and that he should attempt to get through the lines immediately. He had asked him what he thought the property and slaves would fetch. Being acquainted with the estate, he had given him a rough estimate, and had, upon Jackson's giving him full power to sell, advanced him 2/3 of the sum. Jackson had apparently started at once. Indeed, he had told him that he should take the next train as far north as he could get. Vincent received the news with great satisfaction. He had little doubt that Jackson had really made down to the south, and that he would try to cross the lines there, his statement that he intended to go direct north being merely intended to throw his pursuers off his track should a warrant be issued against him. However, it mattered little which way Jackson had gone, so that he had left the state. There was little chance of his ever returning, for even when he learned that his confederate in the business had been killed in the fight, he could not be certain that the prisoner who had been taken was not aware of the share he had in the business. A fortnight later Vincent went down into Georgia, and brought back Lucy Kingston for a visit to his mother. She had already received a letter from her father in reply to one she had written after reaching her aunt's protection, saying how delighted he was to hear that she had crossed the lines, for that he had suffered the greatest anxiety concerning her, and had continually reproached himself for not sending her away sooner. He said that he was much pleased with her engagement to Captain Wingfield, whom he did not know personally, but of whom he had heard the most favourable reports from various Virginian gentlemen to whom he had spoken since the receipt of her letter. Lucy remained at Richmond until the beginning of March, when Vincent took her home to Georgia again, and a week after his return rejoined the army on the Rappahannock. Every effort had been made by the Confederate authorities to raise the army of General Lee to a point that would enable him to cope with the tremendous force the enemy were collecting for the ensuing campaign. The drain of men was now telling terribly, and Lee had at the utmost 40,000 to oppose the 160,000 collected under General Hooker. The first fight of the campaign had already taken place when Vincent rejoined the army. A body of 3,000 Federal cavalry had crossed the river on the 17th of March at Kelly's Ford, but had been met by General Fitz Lee with about 800 cavalry, and after a long and stubborn conflict had been driven back with a heavy loss across the river. It was not until the middle of April that the enemy began to move in earnest. Every ford was watched by Stuart's cavalry, and the frequent attempts made by the Federal horse to push across to obtain information were always defeated. On the 27th of April, General Hooker's preparations were complete. His plan of action was that 20,000 men should cross the river near the old battlefield of Fredericksburg, and thus lead the Confederates to believe that this was the point of attack. The main body were, however, to cross at Kelly's Ford, many miles higher up the river, and to march down towards Fredericksburg. The other force was then to recross, march up the river, cross at Kelly's Ford, and follow and join the main army. At the same time, the Federal cavalry, which was very numerous and well organized, was, under General Stoneman, to strike down through the country towards Richmond, and thus cut the Confederate communication with the capital, and so prevent Longstreet's division, which was lying near Richmond, from rejoining Lee. The passage of the river was effected at the two fords without resistance on the 29th of April, and upon the same day the cavalry column marched south. General Lee directed a portion of his cavalry under General Fitz-Lee to harass and delay this column as much as possible. Although he had with him but a few hundred men, he succeeded in doing good service in cutting off detached bodies of the enemy, capturing many officers and men, and so demoralizing the invaders that, after pushing on as far as the James River, Stoneman had to retreat in great haste across the Rapidan River. Hooker, having crossed the river, marched on to Chancellorsville, where he set to entrench himself, having sent word to General Sedgwick, who commanded the force that had crossed near Fredericksburg, to recross, push round, and join as soon as possible. Chancellorsville was a large brick mansion standing in the midst of fields surrounded by extensive forests. The country was known as the Wilderness. Within a range of many miles there were only a few scattered houses, and dense thickets and pine woods covered the whole country. Two narrow roads passed through the woods, crossing each other at Chancellorsville. Two other roads led to the fords known as Ely's Ford and the United States Ford. As soon as he reached Chancellorsville, Hooker set his troops to work cutting down trees and throwing up earthworks for infantry and redoubts for artillery, erecting a double line of defences. On these he mounted upwards of 100 pieces of artillery, commanding the narrow roads by which an enemy must approach, for the thickets were in many places so dense as to render it impossible for troops to force their way through them. When Sedgwick crossed the river, Lee drew up his army to oppose him, but finding that no more troops crossed and that Sedgwick did not advance, he soon came to the conclusion that this was not the point at which the enemy intended to attack, and in 24 hours one of Stuart's horsemen brought the news that Hooker had crossed the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford and the Rapidan at Ely's Ford. Lee at once left one division to face General Sedgwick, and ordered the three others to join General Anderson, who with 8,000 men had fallen back before Hooker's advance and taken his post at Tabernacle Church, about halfway between Fredericksburg and Tabernacle. Lee himself rode forward at once and joined Anderson. Jackson led the force from Fredericksburg and pressed the enemy back towards Chancellorsville until he approached the tremendous lines of fortifications and then fell back to communicate with Lee. That night a council of war was held, and it was agreed that an attack upon the front of the enemy's position was absolutely impossible. Hooker himself was so positive that his position was impregnable that he issued a general order of congratulation to his troops, saying that the enemy must now ingloriously fly, or give us battle on our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him. Jackson then suggested that he should work right around the Wilderness in front of the enemy's position, march down until well on its flank, and attack it there, where they would be unprepared for an assault. The movement was one of extraordinary peril. Lee would be left with but one division in face of an immensely superior force. Jackson would have to perform an arduous march, exposed to an attack by the whole force of the enemy, and both might be destroyed separately without being able to render the slightest assistance to each other. At daybreak on the 2nd of May, Jackson mustered his troops for the advance. He had in the course of the night caught a severe cold. In the hasty march he had left his blankets behind him. One of his staff threw a heavy cape over him as he lay on the wet ground. During the night Jackson woke, and thinking that the young officer might himself be suffering from the want of his cape, rose quietly, spread the cape over him, and lay down without it. The consequence was a severe cold, which terminated in an attack of pneumonia that, occurring at a time when he was enfeebled by his wounds, resulted in his death. If he had not thrown that cape over the officer, it is probable that he would have survived his wounds. At daybreak the column commenced its march. It had to traverse a narrow and unfrequented road through dense thickets, occasionally crossing ground in sight of the enemy, and at the end to attack a tremendous position held by immensely superior forces. Stuart with his cavalry moved on the flank of the column whenever the ground was open, so as to conceal the march of the infantry from the enemy. As the rear of the column passed a spot called Furnace, the enemy suddenly advanced and cut off the 23rd Georgia, who were in the rear of the column, and captured the whole regiment with the exception of a score of men. At this point the road turned almost directly away from Chancellorsville, and the enemy believed that the column was in full retreat and had not the least idea of its real objective. So hour after hour the troops pressed on until they reached the turnpike road, passing east and west through Chancellorsville, which now lay exactly between them and the point that they had left in the morning. Jackson's design was to advance upon this line of road, to extend his troops to the left, and then to swing round, cut the enemy's retreat to the fords, and capture them all. Hooker had already been joined by 2 of Sedgwick's army corps, and had now 6 army corps at Chancellorsville, while Jackson's force consisted of 22,000 men. Lee remained with 13,000 at Tabernacle. The latter general had not been attacked, but had continued to make demonstrations against the Federal left, occupying their attention and preventing them from discovering how large a portion of his force had left him. It was at 5 o'clock in the evening that Jackson's troops, having gained their position, advanced to the attack. In front of them lay Howard's division of the Federals, entrenched in strong earthworks, covered by felled trees, but the enemy were altogether unsuspicious of danger, and it was not until with tumultuous cheers the Confederates dashed through the trees and attacked the entrenchment that they had any suspicion of their presence. They ran to their arms, but it was too late. The Confederates rushed through the obstacles, climbed the earthworks, and carried those in front of them, capturing 700 prisoners and 5 guns. The rest of the Federal troops here, throwing away muskets and guns, fled in wild confusion. Steadily the Confederates pressed on, driving the enemy before them, and capturing position after position, until the whole right wing of the Federal army was routed and disorganized. For 3 hours the Confederates continued their march without a check, but owing to the denseness of the wood and the necessity of keeping the troops in line, the advance was slow, and night fell before the movement could be completed. 1 more hour of daylight, and the whole Federal army would have been cut off and captured, but by 8 o'clock the darkness in the forest was so complete that all movement had to be stopped. Half an hour later, one of the saddest incidents of the war took place. General Jackson, with a few of his staff, went forward to reconnoitre. As he returned towards his lines, his troops in the dark mistook them for a reconnoitring party of the enemy and fired, killing or wounding the whole of them, General Jackson receiving 3 balls. The enemy, who were but 100 yards distant, at once opened a tremendous fire with grape towards the spot, and it was some time before Jackson could be carried off the field. The news that their beloved general was wounded was for some time kept from the troops, but a whisper gradually spread, and the grief of his soldiers was unbounded, for rather would they have suffered a disastrous defeat than that Stonewall Jackson should have fallen. General Stuart assumed the command, General Hill, who was second in command, having with many other officers been wounded by the tremendous storm of grape and canister that the Federals poured through the wood when they anticipated an attack. At daybreak the troops again moved forward in 3 lines, Stuart placing his 30 guns on a slight ridge where they could sweep the lines of the Federal defences. 3 times the position was won and lost, but the Confederates fought with such fury and resolution, shouting each time they charged the Federal ranks, "Remember Jackson!" that the enemy gradually gave way, and by 10 o'clock Chancellorsville itself was taken, the Federals being driven back into the forest between the houses and the river. Lee had early in the morning begun to advance from his side to the attack, but just as he was moving forward the news came that Sedgwick had recrossed at Fredericksburg, captured a portion of the Confederate force there, and was advancing to join Hooker. He at once sent 2 of his 3 little divisions to join the Confederates who were opposing Sedgwick's advance, while with the 3,000 or 4,000 men remaining to him, he all day made feigned attacks upon the enemy's position, occupying their attention there and preventing them from sending reinforcements to the troops engaged with Stuart. At night he himself hurried away, took the command of the troops opposed to Sedgwick, attacked him vigorously at daybreak, and drove him with heavy loss back across the river. The next day he marched back with his force to join in the final attack upon the Federals. When the troops of Stuart and Lee moved forward, they encountered no opposition. Hooker had begun to carry his troops across the river on the night he was hurled back out of Chancellorsville, and the rest of his troops had crossed on the 2 following nights. General Hooker issued a pompous order to his troop after getting across the river, to the effect that the movement had met with complete success he had anticipated from it, but the truth soon leaked out. General Sedgwick's force had lost 6,000 men, Hooker's own command fully 20,000 more, but splendid as the success was, it was dearly purchased by the Confederates at the price of the life of Stonewall Jackson. His arm was amputated the day after the battle. He lived for a week, and died not so much from the effect of his wounds as from the pneumonia, the result of his exposure to the heavy dew on the night preceding his march through the wilderness. During the 2 days' fighting, Vincent Wingfield had discharged his duties upon General Stuart's staff. On the first day the work had been slight, for General Stuart, with the cannon, remained in the rear, while Jackson's infantry attacked and carried the Federal retrenchments. Upon the second day, however, when Stuart assumed the command, Vincent's duties had been onerous and dangerous in the extreme. He was constantly carrying orders from one part of the field to the other, amid such a shower of shot and shell that it seemed marvellous that anyone could exist within it. To his great grief, Wildfire was killed under him, but he himself escaped without a scratch. When he came afterwards to try to describe the battle to those at the home, he could give no account of it. "To me," he said, "it was simply a chaos of noise and confusion. Of what was going on I knew nothing. The din was appalling. The roar of the shells, the hum of grape and canister, the whistle of bullets, the shouts of the men, formed a mighty roar that seemed to render thinking impossible. Showers of leaves fell incessantly, great boughs of trees were shorn away, and trees themselves sometimes came crashing down as a trunk was struck full by a shell. The undergrowth had caught fire, and the thick smoke, mingled with that of the battle, rendered it difficult to see or to breathe. I had but one thought, that of making my way through the trees, of finding the corps to which I was sent, of delivering my message, and finding the general again. No, I don't think I had much thought of danger. The whole thing was somehow so tremendous that one had no thought whatever for oneself. It was a sort of terrible dream, in which one was possessed of the single idea to get to a certain place. It was not till at last we swept across the open ground down to the house that I seemed to take any distinct notice of what was going on around me. Then, for the first time, the exulting shouts of the men, and the long lines advancing at the double, me up to the fact that we had gained one of the most wonderful victories in history, and had driven an army of 4 or 5 times our own strength from a position that they believed they'd made impregnable. The defeat of Hooker for a time put a stop to any further advance against Richmond from the north. The Federal troops, whose term of service was up, returned home, and it was months before all the efforts of the authorities of Washington could place the army in a condition to make a renewed advance. But the Confederates had also suffered heavily. A third of the force with which Jackson had attacked had fallen, and their loss could not be replaced, as the Confederates were forced to send every one they could raise to the assistance of the armies in the West, where Generals Banks and Grant were carrying on operations with great success against them. The important town of Vicksburg, which commanded the navigation of the Mississippi, was besieged, and after a resistance lasting for some months, surrendered, with its garrison of 25,000 men, on the 3rd of July, and the Federal gunboats were thus able to penetrate by the Mississippi and its confluence into the heart of the Confederacy. Shortly after the Battle of Chancellorsville, Vincent was appointed to the command of a squadron of cavalry that was detached from Stuart's force and sent down to Richmond to guard the capital from any raids by bodies of Federal cavalry. It had been 2 or 3 times menaced by flying bodies of horsemen, and during the cavalry advance before the Battle of Chancellorsville, small parties had penetrated to within 3 miles of the city, cutting all the telegraph wires, pulling up rails, and causing the greatest terror. Vincent was not sorry for the change. It took him away from the greater theatre of war, but after Chancellorsville he felt no eager desire to take part in future battles. His duties would keep him near his home, and would give ample scope for the display of watchfulness, dash, and energy. Consequently, he took no part in the campaign that commenced in the first week of June. Tired of standing always on the defensive, the Confederate authorities determined to carry out the stop that had been so warmly advocated by Jackson earlier in the war, and which might at that time have brought it to its successful termination. They decided to carry the war into the enemy's country. By the most strenuous efforts, Lee's army was raised to 75,000 men, divided into 3 great army corps, commanded by Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill. Striking first into western Virginia, they drove the Federals from Winchester and chased them from the state with the loss of nearly 4,000 prisoners and 30 guns. Then they entered Maryland and Pennsylvania, and concentrating at Gettysburg, they met the Northern army under Meade, who had succeeded Hooker. Although great numbers of the Confederates had seen their homes wasted and their property wantonly destroyed, they preserved the most perfect order in their march through the North, and the Federals themselves testified to the admirable behavior of the troops, and to the manner in which they abstained from plundering or inflicting annoyance upon the inhabitants. At Gettysburg there was 3 days' fighting. In the first, a portion only of the forces were engaged, the Federals being defeated and 5,000 of their men taken prisoner. Upon the second, the Confederates attacked the Northerners, who were posted in an extremely strong position, but were repulsed with heavy loss. The following day they renewed the attack, but after tremendous fighting again failed to carry the height. Both parties were utterly exhausted. Lee drew up his troops the next day, inviting an attack from the Federals, but contented with the success they had gained, they maintained their position, and the Confederates then fell back. Stuart's cavalry protecting the immense trains of wagons loaded with the stores and ammunition captured in Pennsylvania. But little attempt was made by the Northerners to interfere with their retreat. On reaching the Potomac, they found that a sudden rise had rendered the fords impassable. Entrenchments and batteries were thrown up, and for a week the Confederate army held the lines, expecting an attack from the enemy, who had approached within 2 miles. But the Federal generals were too well satisfied with having gained a success when acting on the defensive in a strong position to risk a defeat in attacking the position of the Confederates, and their forces remained impassive until pontoon bridges were thrown across the river, and the Confederate army, with their vast baggage train, had again crossed into Virginia. The campaign had cost the Northern army 23,000 men in killed, wounded, and prisoners, besides a considerable number of guns. The Confederates had only lost 2 guns, left behind in the mud, and 1,500 prisoners, but their loss in killed and wounded at Gettysburg exceeded 10,000 men. Even the most sanguine among the ranks of the Confederacy were now conscious that the position was a desperate one. The Federal armies seemed to spring from the ground. Strict discipline had taken the place of the disorder and insubordination that had first prevailed in their ranks. The armies were splendidly equipped. They were able to obtain any amount of the finest guns, rifles, and ammunition of war from the workshops of Europe, while the Confederates, cut off from the world, had to rely solely upon the makeshift factories they had set up and upon the guns and stores they captured from the enemy. The Northerners had now, as a blow to the power of the South, abolished slavery, and were raising regiments of negroes from among the free blacks of the North, and from the slaves they took from their owners wherever their armies penetrated the Southern states. Most of the Confederate ports had been either captured or were so strictly blockaded that it was next to impossible for the blockade runner to get in or out, while the capture of the forts on the Mississippi enabled them to use the Federal flotillas of gunboats to the greatest advantage, and to carry their armies into the center of the Confederacy. Still, there was no talk whatever of surrender on the part of the South, and indeed the decree abolishing slavery, and still more the action of the North in raising black regiments, excited the bitterest feeling of animosity and hatred. The determination to fight to the last, whatever came of it, animated every white man in the Southern states, and although deeply disappointed with the failure of Lee's invasion of the North, the only result was to incite them to greater exertions and sacrifices. In the North, an act authorizing conscription was passed in 1863, but the attempt to carry it into force caused a serious riot in New York, which was only suppressed after many lives had been lost and the city placed under martial law. While the guns of Gettysburg were still thundering, a Federal army of 18,000 men under General Gillmore, assisted by the fleet, had laid siege to Charleston. It was obstinately attacked and defended. The siege continued until the 5th of September, when Fort Wagner was captured, but all attempts to take Fort Sumter and the town of Charleston itself failed, although the city suffered greatly from the bombardment. In Tennessee there was severe fighting in the autumn. and 2 desperate battles were fought at Chickamauga on the 19th and 20th of September, General Bragg, who commanded the Confederate army there, being reinforced by Longstreet's veterans from the Army of Virginia. After desperate fighting, the Federals were defeated, and 36 guns and vast quantities of arms captured by the Confederates. The fruits of the victory, however, were very slight, as General Bragg refused to allow Longstreet to pursue, and so to convert the Federal retreat into a rout, and the consequence was that this victory was more than balanced by a heavy defeat inflicted upon them in November at Chattanooga by Sherman and Grant. At this battle, General Longstreet's division was not present. The Army of Virginia had a long rest after their return from Gettysburg. It was not until November that the campaign was renewed. Meade advanced, a few minor skirmishes took place, and then, when he reached the Wilderness, the scene of Hooker's defeat, where Lee was prepared to give battle, he fell back again across the Rappahannock. The year had been an unfortunate one for the Confederates. They had lost Vicksburg, and the defeat at Chattanooga had led to the whole state of Tennessee falling into the hands of the Federals, while against these losses there was no counterbalancing success to be reckoned. In the spring of 1864 both parties prepared to the utmost for the struggle. General Grant, an officer who had shown in the campaign in the West that he possessed considerable military ability, united with immense firmness and determination of purpose, was chosen as the new commander-in-chief of the whole military force of the North. It was a mighty army, vast in numbers, lavishly provided with all materials of war. The official documents show that on the 1st of May, the total military forces of the North amounted to 662,000 men. Of these, the force available for the advance against Richmond numbered 284,630 men. This included the Army of the Potomac, that of the James River, and the army in the Shenandoah Valley, the whole of whom were in readiness to move against Richmond at the orders of Grant. To oppose these, General Lee had less than 53,000 men, including the garrison of Richmond and the troops in North Carolina. Those stationed in the seaport towns numbered in all another 20,000, so that if every available soldier had been brought up, Lee could have opposed a total of but 83,000 men against the 284,000 invaders. In the West, the numbers were more equally balanced. General Sherman, who commanded the army of invasion there, had under his orders 230,000 men, but as more than half this force was required to protect the long lines of communication and to keep down the conquered states, he was able to bring into the field for offensive operations 99,000 men, who were faced by the Confederate army under Johnston of 58,000 men. Grant's scheme was that while the armies of the North were under his own command to march against Richmond, the army of the West was to invade Georgia and march upon Atlanta. His plan of action was simple, and was afterwards stated by himself to be as follows: I determined first to use the greatest number of troops practicable against the main force of the enemy, preventing him from using the same force at different seasons against first one and then another of our armies, and the possibility of repose for refitting and producing necessary supplies for carrying on resistance. Second, to hammer continuously against the armed force of the enemy and his resources until, by mere attrition, if in no other way, there should be nothing left to him but submission. This was a terrible program, and involved an expenditure of life far beyond anything that had taken place. Grant's plan, in fact, was to fight, and to keep on fighting, regardless of his own losses, until at last the Confederate army, whose losses could not be replaced, melted away. It was a strategy that few generals had dared to practice, fewer still to acknowledge. On the 4th of May, the great army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan and advanced towards Chancellorsville. Lee moved 2 divisions of his army to oppose them. Next morning the battle began at daybreak on the old ground where Lee had defeated Hooker the year before. All day long the division of Ewell supported the attack of the Army Corps of Sedgwick and Hancock. Along a front of 6 miles, in the midst of the thick forest, the battle raged the whole of the day. The Confederates, in spite of the utmost efforts of the Northerners, although reinforced in the afternoon by the Army Corps of General Burnside, held their position, and when night put an end to the conflict, the invaders had not gained a foot of ground. As soon as the first gleam of light appeared in the morning, the battle was recommenced. The Federal generals, Sedgwick, Warren, and Hancock, with Burnside in reserve, fell upon Hill and Ewell. Both sides had thrown up earthworks and felled trees as a protection during the night. At first the Confederates gained the advantage, but a portion of Burnside's corps was brought up and restored the battle, while on the left flank of the Federals Hancock had attacked with such vigor that the Confederates opposed to him were driven back. At the crisis of the battle, Longstreet, who had marched all night, appeared upon the ground, drove back Hancock's men, and was on the point of aiding the Confederates in a decisive attack upon the enemy, when, riding rapidly forward into the wood to reconnoitre, he was, like Jackson, struck down by the fire of his own men. He was carried to the rear desperately, and it was feared for a time mortally wounded, and his loss paralyzed the movement which he had prepared. Nevertheless, during the whole day the fight went on with varying success, sometimes one side obtaining a slight advantage, the other then regaining the ground they had lost. Just as evening was closing in, a Georgia brigade with 2 other regiments made a detour and fell furiously upon 2 brigades of the enemy and drove them back in headlong rout for 1.5 miles, capturing their 2 generals and many prisoners. The artillery, as on the previous day, had been little used on either side, the work being done at short range with the rifle, the loss being much heavier among the thick masses of the Northerners than in the thinner lines of the Confederates. Grant had failed in his efforts to turn Lee's right and to accomplish his direct advance. He therefore changed his base and moved his army round towards Spotsylvania. Lee soon perceived his object, and succeeded in carrying his army to Spotsylvania before the Federals reached it. On the afternoon of Monday the 9th there was heavy fighting, and on the 10th another pitched battle took place. This time the ground was more open, and the artillery was employed with terrible effect on both sides. It ended, however, as the previous battles had done, by the Confederates holding their ground. Upon the next day there was but little fighting. In the night the Federals moved quietly through the wood, and at daybreak 4 divisions fell upon Johnston's division of Ewell's corps, took them completely by surprise, and captured the greater part of them. But Lee's veterans soon recovered from their surprise, and maintained their position until noon. Then the whole Federal army advanced, and the battle raged till nightfall, terminating the struggle, leaving Lee in possession of the whole line he had held, with the exception of the ground lost in the morning. For the next 6 days the armies faced each other, worn out by incessant fighting, and prevented from moving by the heavy rain which fell incessantly. They were now able to reckon up the losses. The Federals found that they had lost, in killed, wounded, or missing, nearly 30,000 men, while Lee's army was diminished by about 12,000. While these mighty battles had been raging, the Federal cavalry under Sheridan had advanced rapidly forward, and, after several skirmishes with Stuart's cavalry, penetrated within the outer entrenchments round Richmond. Here Stuart with 2 regiments of cavalry charged them and drove them back, but the gallant Confederate officer received a wound that before night proved fatal. His loss was a terrible blow to the Confederacy, although his successor in the command of the cavalry, General Wade Hampton, was also an officer of the highest merit. In the meantime, General Butler, who had at Fort Monroe under his command 2 corps of infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and a fleet of gunboats and transports, was threatening Richmond from the east. Shipping his men on board the transports, he steamed up the James River under convoy of the fleet, and landed on a neck of land known as Bermuda Hundred. To oppose him all the troops from North Carolina had been brought up, the whole force amounting to 19,000 men, under the command of General Beauregard. Butler, after various futile movements, was driven back again to the entrenched camp at Bermuda Hundred, where he was virtually besieged by Beauregard with 10,000 men, the rest of that general's force being sent up to reinforce Lee. In western Virginia, Breckinridge with 3,500 men was called upon to hold in check Sigel with 15,000 men. Advancing to Staunton, Breckinridge was joined by the pupils of the military college at Lexington, 250 in number, lads of from 14 to 17 years of age. He came upon Sigel on the line of march and attacked him at once. The Federal general placed a battery in a wood and opened fire with grape. The commander of the Lexington boys ordered them to charge, and, gallantly rushing in through the heavy fire, they charged in among the guns, killed the artillerymen, drove back the infantry supports, and bayoneted their colonel. The Federals now retired down the valley to Strasburg, and Breckinridge was able to send a portion of his force to aid Lee in his great struggle. After his 6 days' pause in front of Lee's position in Spotsylvania, Grant abandoned his plan of forcing his way through Lee's army to Richmond, and endeavored to outflank it. But Lee again divined his object, and moved round and still faced him. After various movements, the armies again stood face to face upon the old battle-grounds on the Chickahominy. On the 3rd of June the battle commenced at 4:30 in the morning. Hancock at first gained an advantage, but Hill's division dashed down upon him and drove him back with great slaughter, while no advantage was gained by them in other parts of the field. The Federal loss on this day was 13,000, and the troops were so dispirited that they refused to renew the battle in the afternoon. Grant then determined to alter his plan altogether, and sending imperative orders to Butler to obtain possession of Petersburg, embarked Smith's corps in transports, and moved with the rest of his army to join that general there. Smith's corps entered the James River, landed, and marched against Petersburg. Beauregard had at Petersburg only 2 infantry and 2 cavalry regiments under General Wise, while a single brigade fronted Butler at Bermuda Hundred. With this handful of men he was called upon to defend Petersburg and to keep Butler bottled up in Bermuda Hundred until help could reach him from Lee. He telegraphed to Richmond for all the assistance that could be sent to him, and was reinforced by a brigade which arrived just in time, for Smith had already captured a portion of the entrenchments, but was now driven out. The next day Beauregard was attacked by both Smith's and Hancock's corps, which had now arrived. With 8,000 men he kept at bay the assaults of 2 whole army corps, having in the meantime sent orders to Gracie, the officer in command of the brigade before Butler, to leave a few sentries there to deceive that general, and to march with the rest of his force to his aid. It arrived at a critical moment. Overwhelmed by vastly superior numbers, many of the Confederates had left their posts, and Breckinridge was in vain trying to rally them when Gracie's brigade came up. The position was reoccupied, and the battle continued. At noon Burnside with his corps arrived and joined the assailants, while Butler, discovering at last that the troops in front of him were withdrawn, moved out and barred the road against reinforcements from Richmond. Nevertheless, the Confederates held their ground all the afternoon until 11 o'clock at night, when the assault ceased. At midnight Beauregard withdrew his troops from the defences that they were too few to hold, and set them to work to throw up fresh entrenchments on a shorter line behind. At night the men worked with their bayonets, canteens, and any tools that came to hand. It was well for them that the enemy was so exhausted that it was noon before they were ready to advance again, for by this time help was at hand. Anderson, who had succeeded to the command of Longstreet's corps and was leading the van of Lee's army, forced his way through Butler's troops and drove him back into the Bermuda Hundred, and leaving one brigade to watch him, marched with another into Petersburg just as the attack was recommenced. Thus reinforced, Beauregard successfully defeated all the assaults of the enemy until night fell. Another Federal army corps came up before morning, and the assault was again renewed, but the defenders, who had strengthened the defences during the night, drove their assailants back with terrible loss. The whole of Lee's army now arrived, and the rest of Grant's army also came up, and that general found that after all his movements his way to Richmond was barred as before. He was indeed in a far worse position than when he had crossed the Rapidan, for the morale of his army was much injured by the repeated repulses and terrible losses it had sustained. The new recruits which had been sent to fill in the gaps were far inferior troops to those with which he had commenced the campaign. To send forward such men against the fortifications of Petersburg manned by Lee's veteran troops was to court defeat, and he therefore began to throw up works for a regular siege. Fighting went on incessantly between the outposts, but only one great attempt was made during the early months of the siege to capture the Confederate position. The miners drove a gallery under the works, and then drove other galleries right and left under them. These were charged with 8,000 pounds of powder. When all was ready, masses of troops were brought up to take advantage of the confusion which would be caused by the explosion, and a division of black troops was to lead the assault. At 4:45 in the morning of the 30th July the great mine was exploded, blowing 2 guns a battery and its defenders into the air, and forming a huge pit 200 feet long and 60 feet wide. Lee and Beauregard hurried to the scene, checked the panic that prevailed, brought up troops, and before the great Federal columns approached the breach, the Confederates were ready to receive them. The assault was made with little vigor. The approaches to the breach were obstructed by abatis, and instead of rushing forward in a solid mass, they occupied the great pit, and contented themselves with firing over the edge of the crater, where regiments and divisions were huddled together. But the Confederate batteries were now manned, and from the works on either side of the breach, and from behind, they swept the approaches and threw shell among the crowded mass. The Black Division was now brought up, and entered the crater, but only added to the confusion. There was no officer of sufficient authority among the crowded mass there to assume supreme command. No assistance could be sent to them, for the arrival of fresh troops would have added to the confusion. All day the conflict went on, the Federals lining the edge of the crater and exchanging a heavy musketry fire with the Confederate infantry, while the mass below suffered terribly from the artillery fire. When night closed the survivors of the great column that had marched forward in the morning, confident that victory was assured to them, and that the explosion would lay Petersburg open to capture, made their retreat, the Confederates, however, taking a considerable number of prisoners. The Federal loss in killed, wounded, and captured was admitted by them to be 4,000. The Confederate accounts put it down at 6,000. After this terrible repulse it was a long time before Grant again renewed active operations, but during the months that ensued his troops suffered very heavily from the effects of fever, heightened by the discouragement they felt at their want of success, and at the tremendous losses they had suffered since they entered Virginia on their forward march to Richmond. End of chapter 17.
With Lee in Virginia by G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Chapter 18. A Perilous Undertaking. Vincent Wingfield had had an arduous time of it with his squadron of cavalry. He had taken part in the desperate charge that checked the advance of Sheridan's great column of cavalry which approached within 3 miles of Richmond, the charge that had cost the gallant Stuart his life. And the death of his beloved general had been a heavy blow for him. Jackson and Stuart, two of the bravest and noblest spirits of the Confederate army, were gone. Both had been personally dear to Vincent, and he felt how grievous was their loss to the cause for which he was fighting, but he had little time for grief. The enemy, after the tremendous battles of the Wilderness, swung their army round to Cold Harbor, and Vincent's squadron was called up to aid Lee in his struggle there. Then they were engaged night and day in harassing the enemy as they marched down to take up their new base at Petersburg, and finally received orders to ride round at full speed to aid in the defence of that place. They had arrived in the middle of the second day's fighting, and dismounting his men, Vincent had aided the hard-pressed Confederates in holding their lines till Longstreet's division arrived to their assistance. A short time before the terrible disaster that befell the Federals in the mine they exploded under the Confederate works, he was with General Wade Hampton, who had succeeded General Stuart in the command of the cavalry when General Lee rode up. "They are erecting siege works in earnest," General Lee said. "I do not think that you will have any more attacks for the present. I wish I knew exactly where they are intending to place their heavy batteries. If I did, we should know where to strengthen our defenses and plant our counter-batteries. It is very important to find this out, but now that their whole army has settled down in front of us, and Sheridan's cavalry is scouring the woods, we shall get no news, for the farmers will no longer be able to get through to tell us what is going on." "I will try and ride round, if you like, General," Vincent said. "By making a long detour one could get into the rear of their lines and pass as a farmer going into camp to sell his goods." "It would be a very dangerous service, sir," General Lee said. "You know what the consequence would be if you were caught?" "I know the consequence," Vincent said, "but I do not think, sir, that the risk is greater than one runs every time one goes out into battle." "Perhaps not," General Lee replied, "but in one case one dies fighting for one's country by an honorable death, in the other—" and he stopped. "In the other one is shot in cold blood," Vincent said quietly. "One dies for one's country in either case, sir, and it does not much matter, so far as I can see, whether one is killed in battle or shot in cold blood. As long as one is doing one's duty, one death is surely as honorable as the other." "That is true enough," General Lee said.
although it is not the way men generally view the matter. Still, sir, if you volunteer for the work, I do not feel justified in refusing the opportunity of acquiring information that may be of vital consequence to us. When will you start?" "In half an hour, sir. I shall ride back to Richmond, obtain a disguise there, and then go round by train to Burkesville Junction, and then ride again until I get round behind their lines. Will you give me an order for my horse and myself to be taken?" "Very well, sir," General Lee said. "So be it. May God be with you on your way and bring you safely back." Vincent rode off to his quarters. "Dan," he said, "I'm going to be away on special duty for at least 3 days. I've got a couple of letters to write, and shall be ready to start in half an hour. Give the horse a good feed, and have him at the door again by that time." "Am I to go with you, sir?" "No, Dan. I must go by myself this time." Dan felt anxious as he went out, for it was seldom that his master ever went away without telling him where he was going, and he felt sure that the service was one of unusual danger. Nor was his anxiety lessened when at the appointed time Vincent came out and handed him 2 letters. "You are to keep these letters, Dan, until I return, or till you hear that something has happened to me. If you hear that, you are to take one of these letters to my mother, and take the other yourself to Miss Kingston. Tell her before you give it to her what has happened as gently as you can. As for yourself, Dan, you had your letters of freedom long ago, and I have left you $500, so that you can get a cabin and a patch of your own, and settle down when these troubles are over." "Let me go with you, master," Dan said, with tears streaming down his cheeks. "I would rather be killed with you 100 times than get on without you." "I would take you if I could, Dan, but this is service that I must do alone. Goodbye, my boy. Let us hope that in 3 or 4 days at the outside I shall be back here again safe and sound." He wrung Dan's hand, and then started at a canter, and kept on at that pace until he reached Richmond. A train with stores was starting for the south in a few minutes. General Lee's order enabled Vincent to have a horse box attached at once, and he was soon speeding on his way. He alighted at Burkesville Junction, and there purchased some rough clothes for himself, and some country-fashioned saddlery for his horse. Then, after changing his clothes at an inn and putting the fresh saddlery on his horse, he started. It was getting late in the afternoon, but he rode on by unfrequented roads, stopping occasionally to inquire if any of the Federal cavalry had been seen in the neighborhood, and at last stopped for the night at a little village inn. As soon as it was daybreak he resumed his journey. He had purchased at Burkesville some colored calico and articles of female clothing, and fastened the parcel to the back of his saddle. As he rode forward now he heard constant tales of the passing of parties of the enemy's cavalry, but he was fortunate enough to get well round to the rear of the Federal lines before he encountered any of them. Then he came suddenly upon a troop. "Where are you going to, and where have you come from?" "Our farm is a mile away from Union Grove," he said, "and I have been over to Sussex Courthouse to buy some things for my mother." "Let me see what you got there," the officer said. "You are rebels to a man here, and there's no trust in any of you." Vincent unfastened the parcel and opened it. The officer laughed. "Well, we won't confiscate them as contraband of war." So saying, he set spurs to his horse and galloped on with his troop. Vincent rode on to Union Grove, and then, taking a road at random, kept on until he reached a small farmhouse. He knocked at the door, and a woman came out. "Mother," he said, "can you put me up for a couple of days? I'm a stranger here, and all the villages are full of soldiers." The woman looked at him doubtfully. "What are you doing here?" she asked at last. "This ain't a time for strangers. Besides, a young fellow like you ought to be ashamed to show yourself when you ought to be over there with Lee. My boys are both there, and my husband. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a strong-looking young fellow like you, to be riding about instead of fighting the Yankees. Go along! You get no shelter here. I would scorn to have such as you inside my doors." "Perhaps I've been fighting there," Vincent said significantly, "but one can't always be fighting. There are other things to do sometimes. For instance, to find out what the Yankees are doing and what are their plans." "Is that so?" the woman asked doubtfully. "That is so," he answered earnestly. "I am an officer in Wade Hampton's cavalry, and now Sheridan's troopers have cut off all communication. I've come out to find for General Lee where the Yankees are building their batteries before Petersburg." "In that case you are welcome," the woman said. "Come straight in. I will lead your horse out and fasten him up in the bush, and give him a feed there. It will never do to put him in the stable. The Yankees come in and out, and they'd take him off sharp enough if their eyes fell on him. I think you will be safe enough even if they do come. They'll take you for a son of mine, and if they ask any questions, I will answer them sharp enough." "I wonder they have left you a feed of corn," Vincent said, when the woman returned after taking away his horse. "It's no thanks to them," she answered. "They have cleared out everything they could lay their hands on. But I've been expecting it for months, and, as I've had nothing to do since my man and boys went away, I've been digging a great pit in the wood over there, and have buried most of all my corn, and have sorted my pigs down and buried them in barrels, so they didn't find much. They took the old horse and 2 cows, but I hope the old horse will fall down the first time they use him, and the cow meat will choke them as it eats it. Now, is there anything I can do to help you?" "I want a basket with some eggs and chickens or vegetables to take into their camp to sell, but I'm afraid I've not had much chance of getting them." "I can help you there too," the woman said. "I turned all my chickens into the wood the day I heard the Yankees had landed. They've got rather wild-like, but I go out and give them some corn every evening. I expect, if we look about, we shall find some nests. Indeed, I know there are 1 or 2 of them sitting. So if you'll come out with me, we can soon knock down 5 or 6 of the creatures, and maybe get a score or 2 of eggs. As for the vegetables, a horde of locusts couldn't have stripped the country cleaner than they have done." They went out into the wood. 6 hens were soon killed, and hunting about they discovered several nests and gathered about 3 dozen eggs. Vincent aided in plucking the chickens, and they returned to the house. "You had best take a bite before you go," she said. "It's noon now, and you said you started at daybreak. Always get a meal when you can, I say." She produced a loaf and some bacon from a little cupboard hidden by her bed, and Vincent, who, now he thought of it, was feeling hungry, made a hearty meal. "I will pay you for these chickens and eggs at once," he said. "There is no saying whether I shall come back again." "I will not say no to you paying for the chickens and eggs," she said, "because money is scarce enough, and I may have long to wait before my man and the boys come back. But as to lodging and food, I will not touch a cent. You are welcome to all I have when it's for the good cause." Vincent started with the basket on his arm, and after walking 3 miles came upon the Federal camps. Some of the regiments were already under canvas, others were still bivouacked in the open air, as the storeships carrying the heavy baggage had not yet arrived. The generals and their staffs had taken up their quarters in the villages. Vincent had received accurate instructions from his hostess as to the position of the various villages, and avoided them carefully, for he did not want to sell out of his stock immediately. He had indeed stowed 2 of the fowls away in his pocket, so that in case anyone insisted upon buying up all his stock, he could place these in his basket and still push on. He avoided the camps as much as he could. He could see the smoke rising in front of him, and the roar of guns was now close at hand. He saw on his right an elevated piece of ground, from which a good view could be obtained of the fortifications upon which the Federals were working. A camp had been pitched there, and a large tent near the summit showed that some officer of superior rank had his quarters there. He made a detour so as to come up at the back of the hill, and when he reached the top, he stood looking down upon the line of works. They were nearly half a mile distant. The intervening ground had already been stripped of its hedges, and the trees cut down to form gabions, fascines, and platforms for the cannon. Thousands of men were at work, but in some parts they were clustered much more thickly than in others, and Vincent had no difficulty in determining where the principal batteries were in course of construction along this portion of the position. He was still gazing intently when 2 horsemen rode up from behind. "Hello, you, sir! What are you looking at?" one of them asked sharply. "What are you spying about here?" Vincent turned slowly round with a silly smile on his lips. "I'm spying all them chaps at work," he said. "It reminds me for all the world of an ant-hill. Never did I see so many chaps before. What be they a-doing? Digging a big drain or making a roadway, I guess." "Who are you, sir?" the officer asked angrily. "Seth Jones, I be, and mother's sent me to sell some fowls and eggs. Do you want to buy any? Fine birds they be." "Why, Sheridan," laughed the other officer, "this is a feather out of your cap. I thought your fellows had cleared out every hen roost within 20 miles of Petersburg already." "I fancy they've emptied most of them," the general said grimly. "Where do you come from, lad?" "I comes from over there," Vincent said, jerking his thumb back. "I lives there with mother. Father and the other boys have been fighting Yanks, but they wouldn't take me with them because I ain't sharp in my wits, though I tells them I still shoot a Yank as well as they could if they showed me." "And who do you suppose all those men are?" General Sheridan asked, pointing towards the trenches. "I don't know," Vincent replied. "I guess they be niggers. There be too many of them for whites. Besides, whites ain't such fool to work like that. Doesn't he want any fowl?" And he drew back the cloth and showed the contents of the basket. "Take them as a matter of curiosity, General," the other officer laughed. "It will be downright novelty to you to buy chickens." "What do you want for them, boy?" "Mother said as I wasn't to take less nor $1 apiece." "Greenbacks, I suppose?" the officer asked. "I suppose so. She didn't say nothing about it, but I've not seen aught but greenbacks for a long time." "Come along, then," the officer said. "We will take them." They rode up to the large tent, and the officers alighted and gave their horses to the two of the soldiers. "Give your basket to this soldier." "I want the basket back again. Mother would whop me if I came back without the basket again." "All right," the officer said. "You shall have it back in a minute." Vincent stood looking anxiously after the orderly. "Do you think that boy is as foolish as he seems?" General Sheridan asked his companion. "He admits that he comes from a rebel family." "I don't think he would have admitted that if he hadn't been a fool. I fancy he is a half-witted chap. They never would have left a fellow of his age behind." "No, I think it's safe," Sheridan said, "but one can't be too particular just at present. See, the trees in front hide our work altogether from the rebels, and it would be a serious thing if they would find out what we were doing." "That boy couldn't tell them much even if he got there," the other said. "And from this distance he would need a sharp eye and some military knowledge to make out anything of what's going on. Where does your mother live, boy?" "I ain't going to tell you," Vincent said doggedly. "Mother said I wasn't to tell no one where I lived, else the Yankee thieves would be coming down and stealing the rest of our chickens." The officers laughed. "Well, go along, boy. I should advise you not to say anything about Yankee thieves another time, for likely enough you'll get a broken head for your pains." Vincent went off grumbling, and with a slow and stumbling step made his way over the brow of the hill and down through the camps below. Here he sold his last 2 fowls and his eggs, and then walked briskly on until he reached the cottage from which he had started. "I'm glad to see you back," the woman said as he entered. "How have you got on?" "Capitally," he said. "I pretended to be half an idiot, and so got safely out, though I fell into Sheridan's hands. He suspected me at first, but at last he thought I was what I looked, a fool. He wanted to know where you lived, but I wouldn't tell him. I told him you told me not to tell anyone, because if I did, the Yankee thieves would be clearing out the rest of the chickens." "Did you tell him that now?" the woman said in delight. "He must have thought you was a fool. Well, it's a good thing the Yanks should hear the truth sometimes. Well, have you done now?" "No, I've only seen one side of their works yet. I must try round the other flank tomorrow. I wish I could get something to sell that wouldn't get bought up with the first people I come to, something I could peddle among the soldiers." "What sort of thing?" "Something in the way of drinks, I should say," Vincent said. "I saw a woman going among the camps. She had 2 tin cans and a little mug. I think she had lemonade or something of that sort." "It won't be lemonade," the woman said. "I haven't seen a lemon for the last 2 years, but I do get some oranges from Florida. Maybe it was that, or maybe it was spirits and water." "Perhaps it was," Vincent agreed, "though I don't think they would let anyone sell spirits in the camp." "I can't get you any lemons or oranges neither," the woman said, "but I might take you a glass of molasses and herbs with some spirits in it. I've got a keg of old rye buried away ever since my man went off some 6 months ago. I'm out of molasses, but I dare say I can borrow some from a neighbor, and as for herbs, they're about the only thing the Yankees haven't stole. I think I could fix you up something that would do. As long as it's got spirits in it, it don't much matter what you put in besides, only it wouldn't do to take the spirits up alone. You can call it plantation drink, and I don't suppose anyone would ask too closely what it's made of." "Thank you. That will do capitally." The next morning Vincent again set out, turning his steps this time towards the right flank of the Federal position. He had in the course of the evening made a sketch of the ground he had seen, marking in all principal batteries, with notes as to the number of guns for which they seemed to be intended. "Look here," he said to the woman before leaving, "I may not be as lucky today as I was yesterday. If I do not come back tonight, can you find anyone you can trust to take this piece of paper round to Richmond? Of course, he would have to make his way up first to the Burkesville Junction, and then take train to Richmond. When he gets there, he must go down to Petersburg and ask for General Lee. I have written a line to go with it, saying what I've done this for, and asking the general to give the bearer $100. "I will take it myself," the woman said. "Not for the sake of the $100, though I ain't saying as it wouldn't please the old man when he comes back to find I had $100 stored away, but for the cause. My men are all doing their duty, and I will do mine. So trust me, and if you don't come back by daybreak tomorrow morning, I will start right away with these letters. I will go out at once and hide them somewhere in case the Yanks should come and make a search. If you are caught, they might like enough trace you here, and then they would search the place all over, and maybe set it alight. If you ain't here by nightfall, I shall sleep out in the wood, so they won't come and find me here. If anything detains you, and you ain't back until after dark, you find me somewhere near the tree where your horse is tied up." Provided with a large can full of liquor that the woman compounded, and which Vincent, on tasting, found to be by no means bad, he started from the cottage. Again he made his way safely through the camps, and without hindrance lounged upon a spot where a large number of men belonging to one of the negro regiments were at work. "Plantation liquor?" he said again, assuming a stupid air, to a black sergeant who was with them. "First-rate stuff, and only 15 cents a glass." "What plantation liquor like?" the negro asked. "Me no know him." "First-rate stuff," repeated Vincent. "Mother makes it of spirit and molasses and all sorts. 15 cents a glass." "Well, I'll take a glass," the sergeant said. "Mighty hot dis work in de sun. But don't you say nothing about the spirit. They ask you, you just say molasses and all sorts. That's quite enough. The white officer won't let spirits be sold into camp." "Dat very good stuff," he said, smacking his lips as he handed back the little tin measure. "You sell him all in no time." Several of the negroes now came round, and Vincent disposed of a considerable quantity of his plantation liquor. Then he turned to go away, for he did not want to empty his can at one place. He had not gone many paces when a party of 3 or 4 officers came along. "Hello, you, sir! What the deuce are you doing here?" one asked angrily. "Don't you know nobody is allowed to pass through the lines?" "I didn't see no lines. What sort of lines are they? No one told me nothing about lines. My mother sent me out to sell plantation liquor, 15 cents a glass." "What's it like?" one of the officers said, laughing. "Spirits, I will bet $1, in some shape or other. Pour me out a glass. I will try it anyhow." Vincent filled the little tin mug and handed it to the officer. As he lifted his face to do so, there was a sudden exclamation. "Vincent Wingfield!" And another officer, drawing his sword, attacked him furiously, shouting, "A spy! Seize him! A Confederate spy!" Vincent recognized with astonishment in the Federal officer rushing at him with uplifted sword his old antagonist Jackson. Almost immediately he whirled the can, which was still half full of liquor, round his head and dashed it full in the face of his antagonist, who was knocked off his feet by the blow. With a yell of rage he started up again and rushed at Vincent. The latter snatched up a shovel that was lying close by and stood his ground. The officers were so surprised at the suddenness of the incident and the overthrow of their companion, and for the moment so amused at the latter's appearance, covered as he was from head to foot with sticky liquor and bleeding from a cut inflicted by the edge of the can, that they were incapable of interference. Blinded with rage, and with the liquid streaming into his eyes, Jackson rushed at Vincent. The latter caught the blow aimed at him on the edge of the shovel, and then, swinging his weapon round, smote his antagonist with all his strength, the edge of the shovel fairly falling upon his head. Without a cry, the traitor fell dead in his tracks. The other officers now drew their swords and rushed forward. Vincent, seeing the futility of resistance, threw down his shovel. He was instantly seized. "Hello there!" the senior officer called to the men, who had stopped in their work and were gazing at the sudden fray that had arisen. "A sergeant and 4 men!" 4 of the negro soldiers and the sergeant at once stepped forward.
Take this man and conduct him to the village. Put him in a room and stay there with him. Do you, Sergeant, station yourself at the door, so that I shall know where to find you. Put on your uniforms and take your guns." Their men put on their coats, which they had removed while at work, shouldered their muskets, and took their places, 2 on each side of the prisoner. The officers then turned to examine the prostrate comrade. "It's all over with him," one said, stooping down. "The shovel has cut his skull nearly in half. Well, I fancy he was a bad lot. I don't believe in Southerners who come to fight in our ranks. Besides, he was at one time in the rebel army." "Yes, he was taken prisoner," another said. "Then his father, who had to bolt from the South because he said of his Northern sympathies, but likely enough for something else, came round, made interest somehow, and got his son released, and then someone else got in commission with us. He always said he'd been obliged to fight on the other side, but he always been heart and soul for the North. Anyhow, he was always blackguarding his old friends. I always doubted the fellow. Well, there's an end of him. And anyhow, he's done useful service at last by recognizing this spy. Fine-looking young fellow, that. He called him Vincent Wingfield. I seem to remember the name. Perhaps I've read it in some of the rebel newspapers we got hold of. Likely enough, someone in our camp will know it. Well, I suppose we'd better have Jackson carried into camp." 4 more of the negroes were called out, and these carried the body into the camp of his regiment. An officer was also sent from the working party to report the capture of a spy to his colonel. "I will report it to the general," the latter said. "He rode along here about a quarter of an hour ago, and may not be back again for some hours. As we've got the spy fast, it cannot make any difference." As he was marched back to the village, Vincent felt that there was no hope for him whatever. He had been denounced as a spy, and all the lips that had denounced him had been silenced forever. The mischief had been done. He could give no satisfactory account of himself. He thought for a moment of declaring that a mistake had been made, but he felt that no denial would counterbalance the effect of Jackson's words. The fury, too, with which the latter had attacked him would show plainly enough that his assailant was absolutely certain as to his identity, and even that there had been a personal feud between them. Then he thought that if he said he was the son of the woman in the line, she would hear him out in the assertion. But it was not likely that this would be accepted as against Jackson's testimony. Besides, inquiry amongst her neighbors would certainly lead to the discovery that she was speaking an untruth, and might even involve her in his fate as his abettor. But most of all he decided against this course because it would involve the telling of a lie. Vincent considered that while in disguise, and doing important service for his country, he was justified in using deceit, but merely for the purpose of saving his own life, and that perhaps uselessly, he would not lie. His fate, of course, was certain. He was a spy, and would be shot for it. Vincent had so often been in the battlefield, so often under a fire from which it seemed that no one could come alive, that the thought that death was at hand had not for him the terrors that possessed those differently circumstanced. He was going to die for the Confederacy, as tens of thousands of brave men had died before, and he rejoiced over the precaution he had taken as to the transmission of his discoveries on the previous day, and felt sure that General Lee would do full justice to his memory, and announce that he had died in doing noble service to the country. He sighed as he thought of his mother and sisters, but Rose had been married in the spring, and Annie was engaged to an officer in General Beauregard's staff. Then he thought of Lucy away in Georgia, and for the first time his lip quivered and his cheek paled. The negro guards, who had been enlisted but a few weeks, were wholly ignorant of their duties, and having once conveyed their prisoner into the room, evidently considered that all further necessity for military strictness was at an end. They had been ordered to stay in the room with the prisoner, but no instructions had been given as to their conduct there. They accordingly placed their muskets in one corner of the room, and proceeded to chatter and laugh without further regarding him. Under other circumstances this carelessness would have inspired Vincent with the thought of escape, but he knew that it was out of the question here. There were Federal camps all around, and a shout from the negroes would send 100 men in instant pursuit of him. There was nothing for him to do but to wait for the end, and that end would assuredly come in the morning. From time to time the door opened, and the negro sergeant looked in. Apparently his ideas on the subject of discipline were no stricter than those of his men, for he made no remark as to their carelessness. Presently, when he looked in,
The 4 soldiers were standing at the window watching a regiment passing by on its way to take its share of the work in the trenches. Vincent, who was sitting at a table, happened to look up, and was astonished at seeing the sergeant first put his finger on his lips, then take off his cap, put one hand on his heart, and gesticulate with the other. Vincent gazed at him in blank surprise. Then he started and almost sprang to his feet, for in the Yankee sergeants he recognized Tony Morris, but the uplifted hand of the negro warned him of the necessity of silence. The negro nodded several times, again put his hand on his heart, and then disappeared. A thrill of hope stirred every vein in Vincent's body. He felt his cheeks flush, and had difficulty in maintaining his passive attitude. He was not then utterly deserted. He had a friend who would, he was sure, do all in his power to aid him. It was extraordinary indeed that it should be Tony who was now his jailer, and yet, when he thought it over, it was not difficult to understand. It was natural enough that he should have enlisted when the black regiments were raised. He had doubtless heard his name shouted by Jackson, and had, as Vincent now remembered, stepped forward as a sort of volunteer when the officer called for a sergeant and 4 men. Yes, Tony would doubtless do all in his power to save him. Whether it be possible that he could do so was doubtful, but at least there was a hope, and with it the feeling of quiet resignation with which Vincent had faced what appeared to be inevitable at once disappeared, and was succeeded by a restless longing for action. His brain was busy at once in calculating the chances of his being ordered for instant execution, or of the sentence being postponed till the following morning, and, in the latter case, with the question of what guard would probably be placed over him, and how Tony would set about the attempt to aid him to escape. Had the general been in camp when he was brought in, he would most probably have been shot at sunset. But if he did not return until the afternoon, he would most likely order the sentence to be carried out at daybreak. In any case, as he was an officer, some time might be granted to him to prepare for death. Then there was the question of whether he would be handed over to a white regiment for safekeeping, or left in the hands of the black regiment that had captured him. No doubt, after the sentence was passed, the white officers of that regiment would see that a much stricter watch than that now put over him was set. It was not probable that he would still be in charge of Tony, for as the latter would be on duty all day, he would doubtless be relieved. In that case, how he would manage to approach him, and what means would he use to direct the attention of the sentries in another direction? He thought over the plans that he himself would adopt were he in Tony's place. The first thing would be, of course, to make the sentries drunk if possible. This should not be a difficult task with men whose notions of discipline were so lax as those of the negroes, but it would be no easy matter for Tony to obtain spirits, for these were strictly prohibited in the Federal camp. Perhaps he might help Tony in this way. He fortunately had a small notebook with a pencil in his pocket, and as his guards were still at the window, he wrote as follows: "I am captured by the Yankees. So far as I can see, my only chance of escape is to make the sentries drunk. The bearer is absolutely to be trusted. Give him his canteen full of spirits, and tell him what I have written here." He tore this page out, folded it up, and directed it to Mrs. Grossmith, Worley Farm, near Union. Presently Tony looked in again, and Vincent held up the note. The sergeant stepped quickly forward and took it, and then said sharply to the men, "Now then, dis not keeping guard. Suppose door open, dis fellow run away. What they say to you? 2 of you keep your eye on dis man. Suppose Captain Pierce come in and find you all staring out a window. He got nice bobbery." Thus admonished as to their duty, 2 of the negroes took up their muskets and stood with their backs to the door, with their eyes fixed on the prisoner with such earnestness that Vincent could not suppress a smile. The negroes grinned responsively. "Dis bad affair, young sir," one said. "Very bad affair. Of course we soldiers of the Union, and got to fight if they tell us, but no like dis job of keeping guard like dis." "It can't be helped," Vincent said, "and of course you must do your duty. I'm not going to jump up the chimney or fly through the window, and as there are 4 of you, to say nothing of the sergeant outside, you needn't be afraid of my trying to escape." "No, sir, dat not possible nohow. We know dat very well. That's why we no trouble to look after you. But as the sergeant say, watch, of course we must watch. We very pleased to see you kill dat white officer. Dat officer very hard man, and all the men hate him. And when you see him knocked down, we should like to have given cheer. We are all sorry for you. Still, you see, sir, we must keep watch. If you were to get away, there's no saying what they do to us."
"That's all right," Vincent said. "I don't blame you at all. As you say, that was a very bad fellow. I had quarrelled with him before, because he treated his slaves so badly." End of chapter 18. With Lee in Virginia by G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Chapter 19. Free. It was not until late in the afternoon that a white officer entered and ordered the soldiers to conduct the prisoner to the general's tent. "What is your name, sir, and who are you?" the general asked as he was brought in. "I hear that you were denounced by Lieutenant Jackson as being a spy, and that he addressed you as Vincent Wingfield. What have you got to say to the charge?" "My name is Vincent Wingfield, sir," Vincent replied quietly. "I am upon the staff of General Wade Hampton, and in pursuance of my duty I came here to learn what I could of your movements and intentions." The general was silent for a moment. "Then, sir, as you are an officer, you must be well aware of the consequences of being discovered in disguise here. I regret that there is no course open to me but to order you to be shot as a spy tomorrow morning." One of the officers who was standing by the general here whispered to him. "Ah, yes, I remember," he said. "Are you the same officer, sir, who escaped from Elmira?" "I am, sir," Vincent replied, "and at the same time aided in the escape of the man who denounced me today, who then did his best to have me arrested by sending an anonymous letter stating the disguise in which I was making my way through the country. I was not surprised to find that he had carried his treachery further and was now fighting against the men with whom he had formerly served." "He deserved the fate that has befallen him," the general said. "Still, this does not alter your position. I regret that I must order my sentence to be carried out." "I do not blame you, sir. I knew the risks I ran when I accepted the mission. My only regret is that I failed in supplying my general with the information they required." The general then turned to the officer who had brought Vincent up. "This officer will remain in charge of your men for tonight, Captain Pierce. You will see that the sentence is carried into effect at daybreak. I need not tell you that a vigilant guard must be placed over him." Vincent was again marched back to the village, but the officer halted the party when he arrived there. "Stop here a few minutes, Sergeant," he said. "That room is required for an officer's quarters. I'll look round and find another place." In a few minutes he returned, and Vincent was conducted to a shed standing in the garden of one of the houses. "Place one man on guard at the door, and another behind," he said to the sergeant. "Let the other two relieve them, and change the watch once an hour." The sergeant saluted. "The men have been on duty since daylight, sir, and none of us have anything to eat." "Oh, I forgot that," the officer replied. "Very well. I will send another party to relieve you at once." In 10 minutes another sergeant and 4 men arrived at the spot, and Tony and his companions returned to the camp. As soon as Tony had devoured a piece of bread, he left the camp, walked with careless gait through the camps behind, and went on until he reached a village in which were comparatively few soldiers. He went up to a woman who was standing at a door. "Missus," he said, "I have got a letter to take. I ain't very sure as to the name. Will you kindly tell me what is the address read on this paper?" The woman looked at it. "Mrs. Grossmith, Worley Farm, near Union. That's about 2 miles along the road. If you go on, anyone will tell you which is Mrs. Grossmith's." Tony hurried on, for he wanted to get back to the camp before it was dark. He had no difficulty in finding Worley Farm. "Now then, what do you want?" its owner said sharply as she opened the door in reply to his knock. "There's nothing for you here. You can look around if you like. It's been all stripped clean days ago, so I tell you." "Me no want anything, ma'am. Me have a letter for you." The woman in surprise took the note and opened it. She read it through and looked earnestly at Tony. "He says you are to be trusted," she said. "Is that so?" "I would give my life for him 20 times over," Tony replied. "He got me away from a brutal master and brought my wife out of slavery for me. What does he say, ma'am? For the Lord's sake tell me. Perhaps he tell me how to get him clar." The woman read out the contents of the note.
"That's it, missus. Sure enough, that's the way," he exclaimed in delight. "Me think and think all day, and no manage to think of anything except to shoot the sentry and fight with the others, and get him out. But then all the other soldiers come running down, and no escape chance. If me can get the spirits, that's easy enough. Me make them all drunk as hogs." "I can give you that," the woman said. "Is there anything else you will want? What are you going to do with them if you get him free? They will hunt you down like vermin." "I thought we might get down to the river and get over somehow. There'll be no trouble getting over to the cavalry. They have them on every road." "Well, you want some clothes anyhow. You can't go about in these soldier clothes. The first Yank you come across would shoot you for a deserter, and the first of our men as a traitor. Well, by the time you get back tonight, that is if you do come back, I will get up a chest I've got buried with my man's clothes in it. Didn't want to take them away to war with them, so I hid them up." She had by this time dug up the keg from its hiding place, and now filled Tony's canteen. "Thank you, missus. The Lord bless you for what you've done, whether I get Master Wingfield off or whether we both get killed over the job. But I must get back fast as I can. If it was dark before I got to camp, they would wonder where I'd been." "Oh, you've plenty of time," the woman said. "It won't be dark till 8 o'clock, and it's not 7 yet. I will set to and boil a good chunk of pork and bake some cakes. It's no use getting out of the hands of the Yanks and then going and getting starved in the swamps." Directly Tony got back to his regiment, he strolled over to the shed where Vincent was confined. 2 sentinels were on duty. The sergeant and the 2 other men were lying at full length on the ground some 20 yards away. The muskets were beside them, and it was evident to Tony by the vigilant watch that they kept upon the shed that their responsibility weighted heavily upon them, and that Captain Pierce had impressed upon them that if the prisoner escaped, they would certainly be shot. "Well, Sergeant John Newson," Tony began, "I've just walked over to see how you're getting on. My responsible business this. I had 6 hours with him, and it made the perspiration run down my back to think what a job it would be for me if that fellow was to run away." "That's just what this child feels, Sergeant Tony Morris. I'm exactly like that, and that's what these men feel too. Well, I'm all on guard. The captain say, put 2 guard on the shed, and to let the others relieve them every hour. So they shall. But those off duty must watch just the same. When it gets dark, we get close up, so as to be ready to jump in directly we hear a stir. This fellow no fool us." "That's the way, Sergeant Newson. That am the way. Never close your eye, but keep a sharp look on them. It's a pity that you're not in camp tonight." How am dat?" the sergeant asked. "To tell you the truth, Sergeant, 3 or 4 of us have smuggled in some spirits, and you're one of those who would come in for a share of it if you'd been there." "Golly!" the sergeant exclaimed. "But that is very unfortunate. Can't you manage to bring me a little here?" "Well, you know, it's difficult to get out of the camp." "Oh, you could come true. There's no fear of you being caught." "I don't know," Tony replied with an air of reluctance. "Well, I will see about it. If I can crawl through the sentries and bring some for you and the others, I will. It will help you keep awake and keep out the damp." "That's right down good of you," the other said cordially. "You're a good man, Tony Morris, and if I can do as much the same for you some other time, I'd do it." Having settled this, Tony went round to the hospital tent in rear of the regiment, having tied up his face with a handkerchief. "Well, what is it, Sergeant?" the negro who acted as an orderly and sometimes helped the surgeon mix his drugs asked. "The doctor am gone away, and I don't expect he come back again tonight." "That am very bad thing," Tony said dolefully. "Can't you do something for me, Sam Smith? I think you know quite as much as me about the medicines as the doctor himself do." "Not quite so much, Sergeant, not quite so much. But I see no fool. My old mother, she used to make medicine for the plantation, and knew a heap about herbs, so I'm natural that I should take to it. What can I give you?" "Well, Sam, you see sometimes I's afflicted dreadful with the face ache. Just go jump, 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 as if he bust right up. Most times I find the best thing am to put a little laudanum in my mouth and a little bit on the rag and put him outside. The best thing would for you to give me a little bottle of him. Then when the pain come on I could just take him, and not be troubling you every day. And Sam, just you whisper. I got hold of a little good stuff. You give me a tin mug, me share what I got with you." The negro grinned with delight, and going into the tent brought out a tin mug. "That's all right, Sam, but you have no bottle of laudanum too. You just fetch that, and I give you the spirit." The negro went in again, and in 2 minutes returned with a small bottle of laudanum. "There's a fair exchange," Tony said, taking it and handing to the man his mug half full of spirit. "Dat am something like," the black said, looking with delight at the liberal allowance. "Me drink him in last thing at night, then me go to sleep, and no one expect nothing. Where you get dat spirit?" "Never you mind, Sam," Tony said with a grin. "There's more where dat comes from, and maybe you get another taste of it." Then, after leaving the hospital tent, he poured half the spirits away, for he had not now to depend upon the effect of that alone, and it were better not to give it too strong, for that might arouse the suspicion of the guard. Then he uncorked the bottle of laudanum. "I don't know how much to give," he said to himself. "No good to kill 'em. Me don't expect the stuff very strong. These rogues sell all sort of stuff to the government. Anything good enough for the soldier. They give 'em rotten boots and rotten cloth and bad powder, and all sorts of things. I expect they give 'em bad drugs too. However, me risk it. This bottle not very big, anyhow. Won't hold more than 2 or 3 teaspoon. Must risk him." So saying, he poured the contents of the vial into the canteen, and then going to a water cart, filled it up. He waited until the camp was quiet, and then, taking off his boots and fastening in his belt his own bayonet and that of one of the men sleeping near, he quietly and cautiously made his way out of camp. There were no sentries placed here, for there was no fear whatever of an attack, and he had little difficulty in making his way round to the back of the village to the spot where Vincent was confined. He moved so quietly that he was not perceived until he was within a few yards of the shed.
"Sergeant Newsom, am you there?"
"Bless me, what a start you have given me for sure," the sergeant said. "I didn't hear you coming." "You didn't suppose I was coming along shouting and whistling, Sergeant Newsom? Don't you talk so loud. There am no saying who's about. Have you brought the stuff? You don't suppose I should have come all this way to tell you I'd not got it? How am the prisoner?" "Oh, he's there all right. My orders was to look in a little window every 5 minutes, and that when it began to get dark me was to tie him quite tight, and me has done so. One of the sentry goes in every 5 minutes and feels to see if the ropes are tight. He am there, sure enough." "That's quite right, Sergeant Newsom. I know when you come me as the captain knew what he was doing when he chose you for this job. He just pick out the man he considers the very best in the regiment. Now, here's the spirit, and first-rate stuff it am too." "Golly, but it am strong," the sergeant said, taking a long gulp at the canteen. "Dat warmed the cockles up the heart in no time. Yes, it am good stuff. Just the thing for this damp air. I hear as a lot of the white soldiers are down with the fever already, and there'll be lots and lots more if we stop here long. Here, you 2 men, take a drink of this. But mind, you must tell no one about it. 'Tis a secret affair." The 2 negroes each took a long drink and returned the canteen with warm expressions of approval. "The other men are on duty," the sergeant said with the air of a man who knew his business. "They mustn't have none of it, none till he come off. As we are the relief, it am proper and right that we drunk a drop out of the canteen if we want it." "Quite so, Sergeant Newsom," Tony said in a tone of admiration. "That's the way to manage these things. Duty first and pleasure afterward." "It am nearly time to relieve guard," the other said, "and then they can have a drink." In 5 minutes the 2 soldiers relieved those on guard, and they also took a long drink at the canteen, to which the sergeant also again applied his lips. "Now, I must be going," Tony said. "I will leave the canteen for you, Sergeant. I have got some more of the stuff over there, and I dare say you will like another drink before morning." So saying he stole away, but halted and lay down 20 yards distant. In 10 minutes he heard the sergeant say, "I feel as if I could just do 5 minutes sleep. You keep your eyes on the shed, and if you hear any officer coming his rounds, you wake me up." Tony waited another half an hour, and then crawled up. The sergeant was lying on his back, sound asleep. The 2 men with him on their faces, with their rifles pointing towards the shed, as if they dropped off to sleep while they were staring at it. Then he crawled onto the shed. The soldier on sentry at the back had grounded his musket and was leaning against the shed, fast asleep, while the one at the door had apparently slid down in a sitting position and was snoring. "I hope I haven't been giving it to them too strong," Tony said to himself, "but it can't be helped anyhow." He opened the door and entered the shed. "Are you awake, Master Wingfield?" "Yes, I am awake, Tony. Thank God you've come. How did you manage it?" "I managed it, sir, and they're all fast asleep," Tony said as he cut the ropes which bound Vincent. "Now, sir, let's be going quick. There am no saying when they may come round to look after the guards. That's what I've been worrying about the last quarter of an hour." Vincent sprang to his feet as the ropes fell from him and grasped Tony's hand. "Here am a bayonet, sir. I hope we shan't want to use them, but there am no saying." They made their way cautiously across the fields till they approached another camp. A few sentries were walking up and down in front of it, but they crawled round these and passed through the space between the regiment and that next to it. Several other camps were passed, and then, when Vincent knew that they were well in rear of the whole of them, they rose to their feet and started forward at a run. Suddenly Tony touched Vincent, and they both stood still. A distant shout came through the air, followed by another and another. "I expect they have found out we've gone, sir. They go round 2 or 3 times in the night to see that the sentries are awake. Now, sir, come along." They were on the road now, and ran at full speed until they approached Union. They left the track as they neared the village, and as they did so they heard the sound of a horse at full gallop behind them. "That's an orderly taking the news of our escape. Sheridan's cavalry are all scattered all over the country, and there are 2 squadrons at Union Grove. The whole country will be alive at daybreak." Making their way through the fields, they soon struck the track leading to Worley Farm, and in a few minutes were at the door. The woman opened it at once. "I've been watching for you," she said, "and I'm real glad you got safe away. Wait a minute, and I will strike a light." "You'd better not do that," Vincent said. "They've got the alarm at Union Grove already, and if anyone caught sight of a light appearing in your window, it would bring them down here at once." "They can't see the house from Union," the woman said. "Still, perhaps it would be best. Now, sir, I can't do anything for you, because my men's clothes are all the same sort of cut as yours, but here's a suit for this man." Thanking her warmly, Vincent handed the things to Tony. "Make haste and slip them on, Tony, and make your other things up into a bundle, and bring them with you for a bit. We must leave nothing here, for they will search the whole country tomorrow. We will take the horse away too. Not that we want it, but it would never do for it to be found here." "Will you take your letter again?" the woman asked. "No, I will leave it with you. It will be no use now if I get through, but if you hear tomorrow or the next day that I'm caught, please carry it as we arranged." "What is this?" he asked as the woman handed him a bundle. "Here are 8 or 10 pounds of pork," she said, "and some corn cakes. If you are hiding away you'll want something, and I reckon anyhow you won't be able to make your way to our people for a bit. Now, if you're ready, I'll start with you." "You will start with us?" Vincent repeated in surprise. "Certainly I will start with you," the woman said. "How do you think you'd be able to find your way on a dark night like this? No, sir, I will put you on your way till morning. But, in the first place, which line do you mean to take?" "I do not think there is much chance of getting back the way we came," Vincent said. "By morning Sheridan's cavalry will have got a description of me, and they will be scouring the whole country. The only chance will be go north and cross the river somewhere near Norfolk." "I think, sir, you'd better go on with your horse at once. No use wait for me. I'll come along on foot, find my own way." "No, Tony, I shall certainly not do that. We will either get off or be taken together. Well, I think the best plan will be to go straight down to the river. How far is it away?" "About 15 miles," the woman said. "If we got there we can get hold of a boat somehow, and either cross and then make straight for Richmond on foot, or go up the river in the boat and land in the rear of our lines. That we can settle about afterwards. The first thing is to get to the river bank. We're not likely to meet with any interruption in that direction. Of course, the cavalry are all on the other flank, and it will be supposed that I shall try either to work round that way or to make straight through the lines. They would hardly suspect that I shall take to the river, which is covered with their transports and storeships." "I think that is the best plan," the woman said. "There are scarce any villages between this and the river. It's only just when you cross the road between Petersburg and Williamsburg that you'll be likely to meet a soul, even in the daytime. There is scarce even a farmhouse across this section. I know the country pretty well. Just stop a minute, and I'll run up to the wood and fetch down the horse. There's a big wood about a mile away, and you can turn him in there." A few minutes later they started, Vincent leading the horse and Tony carrying the bundles of food and his cast-off uniform. The woman led them by farm roads, sometimes turning off to the right or left,
but keeping her way with a certainty which showed how well she was acquainted with the country. Several times they could hear the dull sound of bodies of cavalry galloping along the roads, but this died away as they got further into the country. The horse had been turned loose a mile from their starting place. Vincent removed the bridle and saddle, saying, "He will pick up enough feed on here for some time. When he gets tired of the wood he can work his way out into a clearing." Here Tony hid away his uniform among some thick bushes, and the three walked steadily along until the first tinge of daylight appeared on the sky. Then the woman stopped. "The river is not more than half a mile in front of you," she said, "so I will say good-bye." "What will you do?" Vincent asked. "You might be questioned as you get near home." "I am going to put up the last house we passed," she said, "about 3 miles back. I know the people there, and they will take me in. I will stop there for a day or two, maybe, then walk back, so I shall have a true story to tell. That's all right." Vincent said good-bye to her, with many hearty thanks for the services she had rendered him, and had almost to force her to take notes for $200 from the bundle he had sewn up in the lining of his coat. "You have saved my life," he said, "and some day I hope to be able to do more to show my gratitude. But you must take this anyhow, to tide you over the hard times, and find food for your husband and sons when they come back from the war." As soon as the woman had turned back, Vincent and Tony continued on their way. The former had, as soon as they were fairly out from the Federal camp, told Tony in a few words that his wife was safe at home and their boy flourishing, and he now gave him further details of them. "And how came you to enter the army, Tony?" "Well, sir, there wasn't much choice about it. The northern people, they talk mighty high about their love for the negro, but I don't see much of it in their ways. Why, sir, there's twice as scornful of a black man as the gentleman is in the South. I enlisted in the army, sir, because they say they go to Richmond, and then I find Dinah and the boy." "Well, Tony, I little thought when I did you a service that it would be the means of you being able to save my life one day." "Not much in that, sir. You saved my life because they would for sure have caught me and killed me. Then you saved my wife for me, then you pay out that Jackson, and now you have killed him. I could have shouted for joy, sir, when I saw you hit him over the head with the shovel, and I saw that this time he'd give no more trouble to no one. I should have done for him very soon, sir. I had my eye upon him, and the first time we go into battle he get a ball in the back. Lucky he didn't see me. He not officer of my company, and me looking quite different in the uniform to what me was when I was on the plantation. But I know him, and whenever I see him pass, I hung down my head and I say to myself, 'My time come soon, Massa Jackson. My time come very soon, and then we gets quits.'" "It is wrong to nourish revenge, Tony, but I really can't blame you very much as to that fellow. Still, I should have blamed you if you had killed him, blamed you very much. He was a bad man, and he treated you brutally, but you see he has already been punished a good deal." "Yes, you knock him down, sir. That very good, but not enough for Tony." "But that wasn't all, Tony. You see, the affair set all my friends against him, and his position became a very unpleasant one. Then, you see, if it hadn't been for you, he would probably have got through our lines again after he escaped with me. Then, you see, his father, out of revenge, stole Dinah away." "Stole Dinah!" Tony exclaimed, stopping in his work. "Why, sir, you have been telling me that she is safe and well with Mrs. Wingfield." "So she is, Tony, but he stole her for all that, and had her carried down into Carolina, but I managed to bring her back. It's a long story, but I will tell you about it presently. Then the knowledge that I found Dinah, and the fear of punishment for his share of taking her away, caused old Jackson to fly from the country, getting less than a quarter of the sum his estate would have fetched 2 or 3 years ago. That was what made him and his son turn Unionists. So, you see, Jackson was heavily punished for his conduct to you, and it did not need for you to revenge yourself." "So he was, sir, so he was," Tony said thoughtfully. "Yes, it does seem as if these things came on kind of one after the other just out of that flogging he gave me. And now he has got killed for just the same cause. If he hadn't been obliged to turn Unionist, he wouldn't have been in that there battery at the time you came there. Yes, I sees that is so, sir, and I's glad now I didn't have a chance of shooting him down, for I should have done so for sure if I had." They had now reached the river. The sun was just showing above the horizon, and the broad sheet of water was already astir. Steamers were making their way up from the mouth of the river laden with stores for the army. Little tugs were hurrying to and fro. vessels that had discharged their cargo were dropping down with the tide, while many sailing vessels lay at anchor, waiting for the turn of tide to make their way higher up. Norfolk was, however, the base from which the Federal army drew the larger portion of its stores, as there were great conveniences for landing here, and a railway thence ran up to the rear of their lines. But temporary wharfs and stages had been erected at the point of the river nearest to the camps in front of Petersburg, and here the cattle and much of the stores required for the army were landed. At the point at which Vincent and Tony had struck the river, the banks were somewhat low. Here and there were snug farms, with the ground cultivated down to the river. The whole country was open and free from trees, except where small patches had been left. It was in front of one of these that Vincent and Tony were now standing. "I do not think there is any risk of pursuit now, Tony. This is not the line on which they will be hunting us. The question is, how are we to get across?" "It's too far to swim, sir." "I should think it was," Vincent said with a laugh. "It's 3 or 4 miles, I should say, if it's afoot. The first question is, where are we to get a boat? I should think that some of these farmhouses are sure to have boats, but the chances are they've been seized by the Yankees long ago. Still, they may have some laid up. The Yanks would not have made much search for these, though they would no doubt take all the larger boats for the use of troops or for getting stores ashore. Anyhow, I'll go to the next farmhouse and ask." "Should I go, sir?" "No, Tony. They would probably take you for a runaway. No, I will go. There can be no danger. The men are all away, and the women are sure to be loyal. I fancy the few who were the other way before will have changed their minds since the Yanks landed." They followed the bank of the river for a quarter of a mile, and then Vincent walked on to a small farmhouse standing on the slope 50 yards from the water. 2 or 3 children who were playing about outside at once ran in upon seeing a stranger, and a moment later 2 women came out. They were somewhat reassured when they saw Vincent approaching alone. "What is it, stranger?" one of them asked. "Do you want a meal? We've got little enough to offer you, but what there is you're welcome to. The Yanks have driven off our cows and pigs and the 2 horses, and have emptied the barns, and pulled up all the garden stuff, and stole the fowls, and carried off the bacon from the beams, so we've got but an empty larder. But as far as bread and molasses go, you're welcome." "Thank you," Vincent said. "I'm not in want of food. What I am in want of is a boat." "Boat!" the woman repeated in surprise. "Yes, I want to get across to the other side, or else get up the river and land between Petersburg and Bermuda." "Sakes alive!" the woman exclaimed. "What do you want to do that for?" "I will tell you," Vincent replied. "I know I can trust my life to any woman in the Confederacy. I am one of General Wade Hampton's officers, and I have come through their lines to find out what they are doing. I have been caught once, but managed to slip through their hands. But there is no possibility of making my way back across the country, for the Yankee cavalry are patrolling every road, and the only chance I have is of getting away by boat." "Step right in, sir," the woman said. "It's a real pleasure to have us one of our officers under our roof." "I have a friend with me," Vincent said, "a faithful negro who has helped me to escape, and who would be hung like a dog if they could lay hands on him." "Bring him in, sir," the woman said hospitably. "I had 4 or 5 niggers till the Yanks came, but they all ran away because they knew they would either be set to work or made to fight, so they went. They said they would come back again when the trouble is over. Maybe they will, and maybe they won't. At first the niggers about here used to look for the Yanks coming, but as the news got about of what happened to those they took from their masters, they concluded they were better off where they were. Call your boy in, sir. Call him in." Vincent gave a shout, and Tony came up at once. "Thank you. We don't want anything to eat," Vincent went on as the woman began to put some plates on the table. "We have just had a hearty meal, and have got enough food for 3 or 4 days in that bundle. But we want a boat, or if we can't find that, some sailors' clothes. If I had them, I would keep along the river down to Norfolk. The place will be full of sailors. We should not be likely to be noticed there." "I can't help you in that," the woman said, "but there are certainly some boats laid up along the shore. Now, Maria, who's got boats that haven't been taken?" "I expect the Johnsons have got one," the other woman replied. "They had a small boat the boys and girls used to go out fishing in. I don't think the Yanks have got that. I expect they hid it away somewhere, but I don't know as they will let you have it. She's a close-fisted woman, is Sarah Johnson." I could pay her for its value, Vincent said. Oh, well, if you could pay her she would let you have it. I don't say she wouldn't, anyhow, seeing as you're an officer and the Yanks are after you. Still, she is close, is Sarah Johnson, and I don't know as she is so set on the Confederacy as most people. I tell you what I will do, sir. I will go down and say a stranger wants to buy her boat, and no questions asked. She is just to show where the boat is hidden, and you are to pay for it, and take it away when you want it." "That would be a very good plan," Vincent said, "if you wouldn't mind the trouble." "The trouble is nothing," she said. "Johnson's place ain't above a mile along the shore." "I will go with you until you get close to the house," Vincent said. "Then, when you hear what she wants for the boat, I'll give you the money for it, and you can show me where it is hidden." This was accordingly done. Mrs. Johnson, after a considerable amount of bargaining with Vincent's guide, agreed to take $20 for the boat, and upon receiving the money sent down one of her boys with her to show her where it was hidden. It was in a hole that had been scooped out in the steep bank some 10 feet above the water's edge, and was completely hidden from the sight of anyone rowing past by a small clump of bushes. When the boys had returned to the farmhouse, the woman took Vincent to the spot, and then they went back together. Here he and Tony had a long talk as to whether it would be better to put out at once or to wait till nightfall. It was finally determined that it was best to make an immediate start. A boat rowed by 2 men would attract little attention. It might belong to any of the ships at anchor in the river, and might be supposed to have gone on shore to fetch eggs or chickens, or with a letter or a message. "You see, both shores are in the hands of the Yankees," Vincent said, "and there will not be any suspicion of a boat in the daytime. At night we might be hailed, and if we gave no answer, fired upon, and that might bring a gunboat along to see what was the matter. No, I think it would be best to go along boldly. There are not likely to be any bodies of Federal troops on the opposite shore except at Fortress Monroe, and perhaps opposite the point where they've got their landing below Petersburg. Once ashore we shall be safe. The peninsula opposite is covered with forest and swamp, and we shall have no difficulty in getting through, however many troops they may have sent across. You know the place pretty well, don't you, Tony?" Tony nodded. "Once across, sir, or the Yank army won't catch us. Me know lots of hiding places." "Them broad hats will never do," the woman said. "But I've got some blue nightcaps I knitted for my husband. They're something like the caps I've seen some sailors wear, anyhow. They will pass at a distance, and when you take your coats and vests off, them coloured flannel shirts will be just the right thing." "That will do capitally, and the sooner we are off the better," Vincent said, and after heartily thanking the 2 women and bestowing a present upon each of the children, they started along the shore. The boat was soon got into the water, the oars put out, and they started. The tide was just low now, and they agreed to pull along at a short distance from the shore until it turned. As soon as it did so, the vessel's anchor would be getting up sail to make up to the landing place, and even had anyone on board noticed the boat put out and had been watching it, they would have other things to think about. "It is some time since we last rowed in a boat together, Tony." "About 3 years, sir. Dat time when you got me safe away. I had a bad fright that day you left me, sir. It came on to blow very hard, and some of de men told me that they not think you would ever get back to the shore. Dat made me awful bad, sir, and me wish over and over again that me have died in the forest instead of you taking me off in a boat and throwing away your life. I never felt happy again, sir, till I got your letter up in Canada, and knew you had got back safe that day." "We had a narrow squeak of it, Tony, and were blown some distance up. We were nearly swamped a score of times, and Dan quite made up his mind that it was all up with us. However, we got through safe, and I don't think a soul, except perhaps Jackson and that rascally overseer of ours, who afterwards had a hand in carrying off your wife, and lost his life in consequence, ever had a suspicion we had been doing more than a long fishing expedition. I will tell you all about it when we get going through the woods. Now I think it's pretty nearly dead water, and we will begin to edge across." End of chapter 19. With Lee in Virginia by G.A.Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Chapter 20. The End of the Struggle. Vincent directed his course so that while the boat's head was still pointing up the stream, and she was apparently moving in the same direction as the ship's, she was gradually getting out to the middle of the river. Had he tried to row straight across, suspicion might at once have been excited. In half an hour they were in the middle of the stream. A vessel passing under full sail swept along at a distance of 100 yards, and they were hailed. Vincent merely waved his hand and continued his course. "I dare say those fellows wonder what we're up to, Tony, but they're not likely to stop to inquire. In another quarter of an hour we shall be pretty safe. Ah, there's a fellow who might interfere with us," he added, looking round. "Do you see that little black thing 2 miles ahead of us? That's a steam launch. If she sees us making over, she's as likely to come over and ask us some questions. We had better head a little more towards the shore now. If it comes to a race, every foot is of importance." Up to now they had been rowing in an easy and leisurely manner, avoiding all appearance of haste. They now bent to their oars, and the boat began to travel a good deal faster through the water. Vincent glanced over his shoulder frequently at the steam launch. "She is keeping straight on in the middle of the channel, Tony. Evidently she hasn't noticed us yet." 10 minutes after passing the ship he exclaimed sharply, "Row, Tony, as hard as you can. The launch has just passed that ship, and has changed her course. I expect the captain has called their attention to us. It's a race now." The boat, at the moment the launch changed her course, was rather more than halfway between the centre of the channel and the shore. The launch was in the centre of the channel, and 3/4 of a mile higher up. She had evidently put on steam as she started to cut off the boat, for there was now a white wave at her bow. "I think we shall do it, Tony," Vincent said. "I don't suppose she can go above 8 miles an hour, and we are certainly going 4, and she has more than twice as far to travel as we have." Those on board the launch were evidently conscious that they were likely to lose the race, for in a few minutes they began to open fire with their rifles. "Fire away," Vincent said. "You ain't likely to hit us 1,000 yards off, and we haven't another 300 to row." The bullets whistled overhead, but none of them struck the water within many yards of the boat, and the launch was still 400 or 500 yards away when the bow of the boat touched the shore. Several muskets were discharged as Vincent and Tony leapt out and plunged into the bushes that came down to the water's edge. The launch sent up a sharp series of whistles, and random shots were for some time fired into the bushes. "It is lucky she didn't carry a small gun in her bow," Vincent said, "for though 700 or 800 yards is a long range for a rifle, they might likely enough have hit us if they'd had a gun. Now, Tony, we shall have to be careful, for those whistles are no doubt meant as an alarm, and although she cannot tell who we are, she will probably steam up, and if they have any force opposite, Bermuda will give them news that 2 suspicious characters have landed, and they will have parties out to look for us." "They can look as long as they like, sir. If those slave hunters can't find people in the swamps, what chance you think those soldiers have? None at all. They haven't got no reward before their eyes, and they won't want to be going in over their shoes in the mud and dirtying their uniforms. No fear of them, sir. They make as much noise when they march in the wood as a drove of pigs. You can hear them 1/4 of a mile away." They tramped on through the woods through which McClellan's force had so painfully made their way during the first advance against Richmond. From time to time they could hear noises in the forest, shouts, and once or twice the discharge of firearms. "They go out hunting, I suppose," Tony said scornfully. They kept steadily on until it began to grow dark in the forest. They were now in the White Oak Swamp, and not 8 miles from Richmond, and they thought it better to pause until it became quite dark, for they might be picked up by any raiding party of cavalry. Vincent was in high spirits. Now that he had succeeded in his enterprise, and had escaped almost by a miracle, he was eager to get back to Richmond and carry his news down to General Lee. Tony was even more anxious to push on. At last, after 3 years' absence, he was to see his wife and child again, and he reluctantly agreed to Vincent's proposal for a halt. "We shan't stop very long, Tony, and I own I am waiting quite as much because I am hungry and want to eat, and because I am desperately tired, as from any fear of the enemy. We walked 20 miles last night from Union Grove to the river, then I walked to the boat, back to the farm, and then back to the boat again. That's 3 more miles, and we have gone another 20 now. I'm pretty nearly dead beat, I can tell you." "I's tired too, sir, but I feel I could go on walking all the night if I was to see Dinah in the morning." Well, I couldn't, Tony. Not to see anyone. I might be willing enough, but my legs wouldn't take me." They ate a hearty meal, and almost as soon as they had finished Vincent stood up again. "Well, Tony, I can feel for your impatience, and so we will struggle on. I have just been thinking that when I last left my mother a week since, she said she was thinking of going out to the orangery for a month before the leaves fell, so it is probable that she may be there now. It is only about the same distance as it is to Richmond, so we will go straight there. I shall lose a little time, of course, but I can be driven over to Richmond, so it won't be too much. Besides, I can put on a pair of slippers. That will be a comfort, for my feet feel as if they were in vices. A cup of tea won't be a bad thing, too." During their walk through the wood, Vincent had related the circumstances of the carrying away of Dinah and of her rescue. When he had finished, Tony had said, "Well, Massa Wingfield, I don't know what to say to you. I thought I owed you enough before, but it were nothing to this. Just to think that you would taken all that pains to fetch Dinah back for me. I don't know how it came you to do it. It seems to me like you've been sent special from heaven to do this poor nigger good. Words ain't no good, sir, but if I could give my life away 100 times for you, I would do it." It took them nearly 3 hours walking before they came in sight of the orangery. "There are lights in the windows," Vincent said. "Thank goodness they are there." Vincent limped slowly along until he reached the house. "You stay out here, Tony. I will send Dinah out to you directly. It will be better for her to meet you here alone." Vincent walked straight into the drawing-room, where his mother and Annie were sitting. "Why, Vincent!" Mrs. Wingfield exclaimed, starting up. "What has happened to you? What are you dressed up like that for? Is anything the matter?" "Nothing is the matter, mother, except that I'm as tired as a dog. Yes, my dress is not quite fit for a drawing-room," he laughed, looking down at the rough trousers splashed with mud to the waist, and his flannel shirt, for they had not waited to pick up their coats as they left the boat. "But nothing is the matter, I can assure you. I will tell you about it directly, but first, please send Dinah here." Mrs. Wingfield rang the bell on the table beside her. "Tell Dinah I want to speak to her at once," she said to the girl that answered it. Dinah appeared in a minute. "Dinah," Vincent said, "has your boy gone to bed?" "Yes, sir. Been gone to bed an hour." "Well, just go to him, and put a shawl round him, and go out through the front door. There's someone standing there you will be glad to see." "Is it Tony, sir? For the Lord's sake, is it Tony?" Vincent nodded, and with a little scream of joy she turned and ran straight to the front door. She could not wait now even to fetch her boy, and in another moment she was clasped in her husband's arms. "Now, Vincent, tell us all about it," his mother said. "Don't you see we are dying of curiosity?" "And I am dying of fatigue," Vincent said, "which is a much more painful sort of death, and I can think of nothing else until I've got these boots off. Annie, do run and tell them to bring me a pair of slippers and a cup of tea, and I shall want the buggy at the door in half an hour." "You're not going away again tonight, Vincent, surely?" his mother said anxiously. "You do look completely exhausted." "I am exhausted, mother. I have walked 7 or 48 miles, and this cavalry work spoils one for walking altogether." "Walked 48 miles, Vincent? What on earth have you done that for?" "Not from choice, I can assure you, mother, but you know the old saying, needs must when the devil drives, and in the present case you must read Yankee instead of the Gentleman in Black." "But has Petersburg fallen?" Mrs. Wingfield asked in alarm. "No, Petersburg is safe, and is likely to continue so. But you must be really patient, mother, until I've had some tea, then you can hear the story in full." When the servant came in with the tea, Vincent told her that she was to tell Dinah, whom she would find on the veranda, to bring her husband into the kitchen, and to give him everything he wanted. Then, as soon as he had finished tea, he told his mother and sister the adventures he had gone through. Both were crying when he had finished. "I am proud of you, Vincent," his mother said. "It is hard on us that you should run such risks. Still, I do not blame you, my boy, for if I had 10 sons, I would give them all for my country." Vincent had but just finished the story when the servant came in and said that the buggy was at the door. "I will go in my slippers, mother, but I will run up and change my other things. It's lucky I've got a spare suit here. Any of our fellows who happen to be going down tonight in the train would think that I was mad were I to go like this." It was 1 o'clock in the morning when Vincent reached Petersburg. He went straight to his quarters, as it would be no use waking General Lee at that hour. A light was burning in his room, and Dan was asleep at the table with his head on his arms. He leapt up with a cry of joy as his master entered. "Well, Dan, here I am safe again," Vincent said cheerily. "I hope you had not begun to give me up."
"I begun to be terribly frightened, sir, terribly frightened. I went this afternoon and asked Captain Burley if he had any news of you. He said no, and asked me if I knew where you were. I said no, sir, I knew nothing about it, except you had gone on some dangerous job. He said he hoped you'd be back very soon, and certainly, as far as they had heard, nothing had happened to you. Still, I was very anxious, and thought I would sit up till the last train came in from Richmond. Then I think I dropped off to sleep."
"I think you did, Dan. Well, I'm too tired to tell you anything about it now, but I have one piece of news for you. Tony has come back to his wife."
"That's good news, sir, very good news. I had begun to be afraid that Tony had been shot or hung or something. I know Dinah had been fretting about him, though she never said much. But when I am at home she always asks me lots of questions about him. She's a very glad woman now."
The next morning Vincent went to General Lee's quarters.
"I am heartily glad to see you back," the general said warmly as he entered. "I have blamed myself for letting you go. Well, what success have you had?"
"Here is a rough plan of the works, General. I have had not time to do it out fairly, but it shows the positions of all their principal batteries, with a rough estimate as to the number of guns that each is intended to carry."
"Excellent!" the general said, glancing over at the plan. "This will give us exactly the information we want. We must set to with our counterworks at once. The country is indeed indebted to you, sir. So you managed to cheat the Yankees altogether?"
"I should have cheated them, sir, but unfortunately I came across an old acquaintance who denounced me, and I had a narrow escape of being shot."
"Well, Captain Wingfield, I must see about this business, and give orders at once. Will you come and breakfast with me at 8:30? Then you can give me an account of your adventures."
Vincent returned to his quarters, and spent the next 2 hours in making a detailed drawing of the enemy's positions and batteries, and then at 8:30 walked over to General Lee's quarters. The general returned in a few minutes with General Wade Hampton and several other officers, and they at once sat down to breakfast. As the meal was proceeding, an orderly entered with a telegram for the general. General Lee glanced through it.
"This, gentlemen, is from the Minister of War. I acquainted him by telegraph this morning that Captain Wingfield, who had volunteered for this dangerous service, had just returned from the Federal lines with a plan of the positions and strengths of all the works that they are erecting. I said that I trusted that such distinguished service as he had rendered would at once be rewarded with promotion, and the minister telegraphs to me now that he has this morning signed this young officer's commission as major. I heartily congratulate you, sir, on your well-earned step. And now, as I see you have finished your breakfast, perhaps you will give us an account of your proceedings."
Vincent gave a detailed account of his adventures, which were heard with surprise and interest.
"That was a narrow escape indeed," the general said as he finished. "It was a marvelous thing your lighting upon this negro, whom you say you had once had an opportunity of serving, just at that moment, and although you do not tell us the nature of this service that you had just rendered him, it must indeed have been a very considerable service, or he would never have risked his life in that way to save yours. When these negroes do feel attachment for their masters, there are no more faithful and devoted fellows. Well, in your case, certainly a good action has met with its reward. If it had not been for him, there could be no question that your doom was sealed. It's a strange thing, too, your meeting that traitor. I remember reading about that escape of yours from the Yankee prison. He must have been an ungrateful villain, after your taking him with you."
"He was a bad fellow altogether, I'm afraid," Vincent said, "and the quarrel between us was a long-standing one."
"Whatever your quarrel was," the general said hotly, "a man who would betray even an enemy to death in that way is a villain. However, he has gone to his account, and the country can forgive his treachery to her, as I have no doubt you have already done his conduct towards yourself."
A short time afterwards Vincent had leave for a week, as things were quiet at Petersburg. "Mother," he said on the morning after he got home, "I fear that there is no doubt whatever now how this struggle will end. I think we might keep Grant at bay here, but Sherman is too strong for us down in Georgia. We are already cut off from most of the southern states, and in time Sherman will sweep round here, and then it will be all over. You see it yourself, don't you, Mother?" "Yes. I'm afraid it cannot continue much longer, Vincent. Well, of course, we shall fight to the end." "I'm not talking of giving up, Mother. I'm looking forward to the future. The first step will be that all the slaves will be freed. Now, it seems to me that however attached they may be to their masters and mistresses, they will lose their heads over this, flock into the towns, and nearly starve there, or else take up little patches of land and cultivate them and live from hand to mouth, which will be the ruin to the present owners as well as to them. Anyhow, for a time all will be confusion and disorder. Now, my idea is this: if you give all your slaves their freedom at once, offer them patches of land for their own cultivation, and employ them at wages, you will find that a great many of them will stop with you. There is nowhere for them to go at present, and nothing to excite them, so before the general crash comes they will have settled down quietly to work here in their new positions, and will not be likely to go away." "It is a serious step to take, Vincent," Mrs. Wingfield said, after thinking the matter over in silence for some time. "You do not think there is any probability of the ultimate success of our cause?" "None, Mother. I do not think there is even a possibility. One by one the southern states have been wrested from the Confederacy. Sherman's march will completely isolate us. We have put our last available man in the field, and tremendous as the losses of the enemy, they are able to fill the gaps as fast as they are made. No, Mother, do not let us deceive ourselves on that head. The end must come, and that before long. The slaves will unquestionably be freed, and the only question for us is how to soften the blow. There is no doubt that our slaves, both at the Orangery and at the other plantations, are contented and happy, but you know how fickle and easily led the negroes are, and in the excitement of finding themselves free and able to go where they please, you may be sure that the greater number will wander away. My proposal is that we should at once mark out a plot of land for each family, and tell them that as long as they stay here it is theirs rent-free, and they will be paid for their work upon the estate 3, 4, or 5 days a week, as they can spare time from their own plots. In this way they will be settled down and have crops upon their plots of land before the whole black population is upset by the sudden abolition of slavery." "But supposing they won't work at all, even for wages, Vincent?" "I should not have given them the option, Mother. It will be a condition of their having their plots of land free that they shall work at least 3 days a week for wages." "I will think over what you say, Vincent, and tell you my decision in the morning. I certainly think your plan is a good one." The next morning Mrs. Wingfield told Vincent that she had decided to adopt his plan. He at once held a long consultation with the overseer, and decided which field should be set aside for the allotments, choosing land close to the negroes' quarters, and suitable for the raising of vegetables for sale in the town. In the afternoon Mrs. Wingfield went down with him. The bell was rung, and the whole of the slaves assembled. Vincent then made them a speech. He began by reminding them of the kind of treatment they had always received, and of the good feeling that had existed between the owners of the Orangery and their slaves. He praised them for their good conduct since the beginning of the troubles, and said that his mother and himself had agreed that they would now take steps to reward them, and to strengthen the tie between them. They would all be granted their freedom at once, and a large plot of land would be given to each man, as much as he and his family could cultivate with an average of 2 days a week steady labour. Those who liked would, of course, be at liberty to leave, but he hoped that none of them would avail themselves to this freedom, for nowhere would they do so well as by accepting the offer he had made them. All who accepted the offer of a plot of land rent-free must understand that it was granted them upon the condition that they would labour upon the estate for at least 3 days a week, receiving a rate of pay similar to that earned by other freed negroes. Of course, they would be at liberty to work 4 or 5 days a week if they chose, but at least they must work 3 days, and anyone failing to do this would forfeit his plot of land. 3 days' work, he said, will be sufficient to provide all necessaries for yourselves and families, and the produce of your land you can sell, and will so be able to lay by an ample sum to keep yourselves in old age. I have already plotted out the land, and you shall cast lots for choice of the plots. There will be a little delay before all your papers of freedom can be made out, but the arrangement will begin from today, and henceforth you will be paid for all labour done on the estate. Scarcely a word was spoken when Vincent concluded. The news was too surprising to the negroes for them to be able to understand it all at once. Dan and Tony, to whom Vincent had already explained the matter, went among them, and they gradually took in the whole of Vincent's meaning. A few received the news with great joy, but many others were depressed rather than rejoiced at the responsibilities of their new positions. Hitherto they had been clothed and fed, the doctor attended them in sickness, their master would care for them in old age. They had been literally without a care for the morrow, and the thought that in future they would have to think of all these things for themselves almost frightened them. Several of the older men went up to Mrs. Wingfield and positively declined to accept their freedom. They were quite contented and happy and wanted nothing more. They had worked on the plantation since they had been children, and freedom offered them no temptations whatever. "Whatever had we better do, Vincent?" Mrs. Wingfield asked. "I think, mother, that it would be best to tell them that all who wish can remain upon the old footing, but their papers will be made out, and if at any time they wish to have their freedom, they will only have to say so. No doubt they will soon become accustomed to the idea, and seeing how comfortable the others are with their pay and the produce of their gardens, they will soon fall in with the rest. Of course, it will decrease the income from the estate, but not so much as you would think. They will be paid for their labour, but we shall have neither to feed nor clothe them, and I think we shall get better labour than we do now, for the knowledge that those who do not work steadily will lose their plots of land and have to go out into the world to work, their places being filled by others, will keep them steady. It's an experiment, Vincent, and we shall see how it works." "It's an experiment I have often thought I should like to make, mother, and now you see it is almost forced upon us. Tomorrow I will ride over to the other plantations and make the same arrangements." During the month of August many battles took place around Petersburg. On the 12th the Federals attacked, but were repulsed with heavy loss, and 2,500 prisoners were taken. On the 21st the Confederates attacked, and obtained a certain amount of success, killing, wounding, and capturing 2,400 men. Petersburg was shelled day and night, and almost continuous fighting went on. Nevertheless, up to the middle of October the positions of the armies remained unaltered. On the 27th of that month the Federals made another general attack, but were repulsed with the loss of 1,500 men. During the next 3 months there was little fighting, the Confederates having now so strengthened their lines by incessant toil that even General Grant, reckless of the lives of his troops as he was, hesitated to renew the assault. But in the South General Sherman was carrying all before him. Generals Hood and Johnston, who had commanded the Confederate armies there, had fought several desperate battles, but the forces opposed to them were too strong to be driven back. They had marched through Georgia to Atlanta and captured that important town on the 1st of September, and obtained command of the network of railways, and thus cut off a large portion of the Confederacy from Richmond. Then Sherman marched south, wasting the country through which he marched, and capturing Savannah on the 21st of September. While he was doing so, General Hood had marched into Tennessee, and after various petty successes was defeated, after 2 days' hard fighting, near Nashville. In the 3rd week in January, 1865, Sherman set out with 60,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry from Savannah, laying waste the whole country, burning, pillaging, and destroying. The town of Columbia was occupied, sacked, and burnt, the white men and women and even the negroes being horribly ill-treated. The Confederates evacuated Charleston at the approach of the enemy, setting it in flames rather than allow it to fall into Sherman's hands. The Federal army then continued its devastating route through South Carolina, and at the end of March had established itself at Goldsboro in North Carolina, and was in readiness to aid Grant in his final attack on Richmond. Lee, seeing the imminence of the danger, made an attack upon the enemy in front of Petersburg, but was repulsed. He had now but 37,000 men with which to oppose an enemy of nearly 4 times that strength in front of him, while Sheridan's cavalry, 10,000 strong, threatened his flank, and Sherman with his army was but a few days' march distant. There was fierce fighting on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of March, and on the 2nd of April the whole Federal army assaulted the positions at Petersburg, and after desperate fighting succeeded in carrying them. The Confederate troops, outnumbered and exhausted as they were by the previous week's marching and fighting, yet retained their discipline, and Lee drew off with 20,000 men and marched to endeavour to effect a junction with Johnston, who was still facing Sherman. But his men had but one day's provision with them. The stores that he had ordered to await them at the point to which he directed his march had not arrived there when they reached it, and, harassed at every foot of their march by Sheridan's cavalry and Ord's infantry, the force fought its way on. The horses and mules were so weak from want of food that they were unable to drag the guns, and the men dropped in numbers from fatigue and famine. Sheridan and Ord cut off 2 corps, but General Lee, with but 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, still pressed forward towards Lynchburg. But Sheridan threw himself in the way, and, finding that no more could be done, General Lee and the infantry surrendered, and a few days later Generals Lee and Grant met and signed terms of peace. General Johnston's army surrendered to General Sherman, and the long and desperate struggle was at an end. It was a dreadful day in Richmond when the news came that the lines of Petersburg were forced, and that General Lee no longer stood between the city and the invaders. The President and ministers left at once, and were followed by all the better class of inhabitants who could find means of conveyance. The negroes, Irish, and some of the lower classes at once set to work to pillage and burn, and the whole city would have been destroyed had not a Federal force arrived and at once suppressed the rioting. Whatever had been the conduct of the Federal troops during the last year of the war, however great the suffering they had inflicted upon the unarmed and innocent population of the country through which they marched, the terms of peace that General Grant agreed upon, and which were, although with some reluctance ratified by the government, were in the highest degree liberal and generous. No one was to be injured or molested for the share he had taken in the war. A general amnesty was granted to all, and the states were simply to return to the position in the Union that they occupied previous to the commencement of the struggle. More liberal terms were never granted by a conqueror to the vanquished. Vincent was with the cavalry who escaped prior to Lee's surrender, but as soon as the terms of peace were ratified, the force was disbanded, and he returned home. He was received with the deepest joy by his mother and sister. "Thank God, my dear boy, that it's all over, and you have been preserved to us. We are beaten, but no one can say that we have been disgraced. Had every state done its duty as Virginia has, we should never have been overpowered. It has been a terrible 4 years, and there are few families indeed that have no losses to mourn." "It was well you were not in Richmond, mother, the day of the riots." "Yes, but we had our trouble here too, Vincent. A number of the slaves from some of the plantations came along this way and wanted our hands to join them to burn down their quarters and the house, and to march to Richmond. Tony and Dan, hearing of their approach, armed themselves with your double-barreled guns, went down and called out the hands, and armed them with hoes and other implements. When the negroes came up, there was a desperate quarrel, but our hands stood firm, and Tony and Dan declared they would shoot the first 4 men that advanced, and at last they drew off and made their way to Richmond. Your plan had succeeded admirably. 1 or 2 of the hands went to Richmond next day, but returned a day or 2 afterwards, and begged so hard to be taken on again that I forgave them. Since then everything has been going on as quietly and regularly as usual, while there is scarcely a man left on any of the estates near. And now, mother, that I find things are quiet and settled here, I shall go down to Georgia and fetch Lucy home. I shall be of age in a few months, and the house on the estate that comes to me then can be enlarged a bit, and we will do very well." "Not at all, Vincent. Annie will be married next month. Herbert Rousell was here 2 days ago, and it's all settled. So I shall be alone here. It will be very lonely and dull for me, Vincent, and I would rather give up the reins of government to Lucy and live here with you, if you like the plan." "Certainly I should like it, mother, and so I am sure would Lucy." "Well, at any rate, Vincent, we will try the experiment, and if it does not work out well, I will take possession of the other house." "There is no fear of that, mother, none whatever." "And when are you thinking of getting married, Vincent?" "At once, mother. I wrote to her the day we were disbanded, saying that I should come in a week, and would allow another week, and no longer, for her to get ready." "Then in that case, Vincent, Annie and I will go down with you. Annie will not have much to do to get ready for her own wedding. It must, of course, be a very quiet one, and there will be no array of dresses to get, for I suppose it will be some time yet before the railways are open again, and things begin to come down from the north." Happily Antioch had escaped the ravages of war, and there was nothing to mar the happiness of the wedding. Lucy's father had returned, having lost a leg in one of the battles of the Wilderness a year before, and her brother had also escaped. After the wedding they returned to their farm in Tennessee, and Mrs. Wingfield, Annie, Vincent, and Lucy went back to the Orangery. For the next 3 or 4 years times were very hard in Virginia, and Mrs. Wingfield had to draw upon her savings to keep up the house in its former state, while the great majority of the planters were utterly ruined. The negroes, however, for the most part, remained steadily working on the estate. A few wandered away, but their places were easily filled. For the majority of freed slaves very soon discovered that their lot was a far harder one than it had been before, and that freedom so suddenly given was a curse rather than a blessing to them. Thus, while so many went down, the Wingfields weathered the storm, and the step that had been taken in preparing their hands for the general abolition of slavery was a complete success. With the gradual return of prosperity to the South, the prices of produce improved, and 10 years after the conclusion of the rebellion, the income of the Orangery was nearly as large as it had been previous to its outbreak. Vincent, 2 years after the conclusion of the struggle, took his wife over to visit his relations in England, and, since the death of his mother in 1879, has every year spent 3 or 4 months at home, and will not improbably ere long sell his estates in Virginia and settle in England altogether. This is the end of With Lee in Virginia by G. A. Henty.